Kronstadt Commune by Mett. The Kronstadt events. Quote, a new white plot expected and undoubtedly prepared by the French Counterrevolution, end quote. Pravda, March 3rd, 1921. Quote, white generals, you all know it, played a great part in this. This is fully proved, end quote. Lenin, report delivered to the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party. Quote, the Bolsheviks denounced the men of Kronstadt as counter-revolutionary mutineers led by a white general. The denunciation appears to have been groundless, end quote. Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet Armed, which is an installment of Isaac Deutscher's, I believe, 3-part biography of Leon Trotsky. Quote, no pretense was made that the Kronstadt mutineer were white guards, end quote. Brian Pierce, historian of the Socialist Labor League. Section 1. Background to the Kronstadt insurrection. The Kronstadt insurrection broke out 3 months after the conclusion of the Civil War on the European front. As the Civil War drew to a victorious end, and the working masses of Russia were in a state of chronic famine, they were also increasingly dominated by a ruthless regime ruled by a single party. The generation which had made October still remembered the promise of the social revolution and the hopes they had of building a new kind of society. This generation had comprised a very remarkable section of the working class. It had reluctantly abandoned its demands for equality and for real freedom, believing them to be, if not incompatible with war, at least difficult to achieve under wartime conditions. But once victory was assured, the workers in the towns, the sailors, the Red Army men, and the peasants, all those who had shed their blood during the Civil War, could see no further justification for their hardships and for blind submission to a ferocious discipline. Even if these might have had some reason in wartime, such reasons no longer applied. While many had been fighting at the front, others, those enjoying dominant positions in the state apparatus, had been consolidating their power and detaching themselves more and more from the workers. The bureaucracy was already assuming alarming proportions. The state machine was in the hands of a single party, itself more and more permeated by careerist elements. A non-party worker was worth less on the scale of everyday life than an ex-bourgeois or nobleman who had belatedly rallied to the party. Free criticism no longer existed. Any party member could denounce as, quote, counter-revolutionary end quote, any worker simply defending his class rights and his dignity as a worker. Industrial and agricultural production were declining rapidly. There were virtually no raw materials for the factories. Machinery was worn and neglected. The main concern of the proletariat was the bitter fight against famine. Thefts from the factories had become a sort of compensation for miserably paid labor. Such thefts continued despite the repeated searches carried out by the Cheka at the factory gates. Workers who still had connections with the countryside would go there to barter old clothes, matches, or salt in exchange for food. The trains were crammed with such people. The Metchniki. Despite 1,000 difficulties, they would try to bring food to the famished cities. Food to the famished cities. Working-class anger would break out repeatedly as barrages of militia confiscated the paltry loads of flour or potatoes workers would be carrying on their backs to prevent their children from starving. The peasants were submitted to compulsory requisitions. They were sowing less despite the danger of famine that now resulted from bad crops. Bad crops had been common. Under ordinary conditions, such crops had not automatically had these disastrous effects. The cultivated areas were larger, and the peasants would usually set something aside for more difficult times. The situation preceding the Kronstadt uprising can be summed up as a fantastic discrepancy between promise and achievement. There were harsh economic difficulties, but as important was the fact that the generation in question had not forgotten the meaning of the rights it had struggled for during the revolution. This was to provide the real psychological background to the uprising. The Red Army had problems of its own. Since the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, or peace, the government had undertaken a complete reorganization of the armed forces on the basis of a rigid discipline, a discipline quite incompatible with the erstwhile principle of election of officers by the men. A whole hierarchical structure had been introduced. This had gradually stifled the democratic tendencies which had prevailed at the onset of the revolution. For purely technical reasons, such a reorganization had not been possible in the Navy, where revolutionary traditions had strong roots. Most of the naval officers had gone over to the whites, and the sailors still retained many of the democratic rights they had won in 1917. It had not been possible to completely dismantle their organizations. This state of affairs was in striking contrast with what pertained in the rest of the armed forces. It could not last. Differences between rank-and-file sailors and the higher command of the armed forces steadily increased. With the end of the Civil War in European Russia, these differences became explosive. Discontent was rampant not only among the non-party sailors, it also affected communist sailors. Attempts to, quote, discipline, end quote, the fleet by introducing, quote, army customs, end quote, met with stiff resistance from 1920 on. Zoff, a leading party member and a member of the Revolutionary War Committee for the Baltic Fleet, was officially denounced by the communist sailors for his, quote, dictatorial attitudes, end quote. The enormous gap developing between the rank and file and the leadership was shown up during the elections to the 8th Congress of Soviets, held in December 1920. At the naval base of Petrograd, large numbers of sailors had noisily left the electoral meeting, openly protesting against the dispatch there as official delegates of people from Politotdel and from Komflot, i.e., from the very organizations monopolizing political control of the Navy. On the 15th of February 1921, the Second Conference of Communist Sailors of the Baltic Fleet had met. It had assembled 300 delegates who had voted for the following resolutions. Quote, this Second Conference of Communist Sailors condemns the work of Pobalt, political section of the Baltic Fleet. 1. Pobalt has not only separated itself from the masses, but also from the active functionaries. It has become transformed into a bureaucratic organ enjoying no authority among the sailors. 2. There is total absence of plan or method in the works of Pobalt. There is also a lack of agreement between its actions and the resolutions adopted at the Ninth Party Congress. 3. Pobalt, having totally detached itself from the party masses, had destroyed all local initiative. It has transformed all political work into paperwork. This has had harmful repercussions on the organization of the masses in the fleet. Between June and November last year, 20% of the Sailor Party members have left the party. This can be explained by the wrong methods of the work of Pobalt. 4. The cause is to be found in the very principles of Pobalt's organization. These principles must be changed in the direction of greater democracy. End quote. The Second Conference of Communist Sailors of the Baltic Fleet. That was the resolution. Several delegates demanded in their speeches that the total abolition of the, quote, political sections, end quote, in the Navy, a demand that we will find voiced again in the sailors' resolutions during the Kronstadt uprising. This was the frame of mind in which the famous discussion on the trade union question preceding the 10th Party Congress took place. In the documents of the period, one can clearly perceive the will of certain Bolshevik leaders, amongst whom Trotsky, not only to ignore the great discontent affecting the workers and all those who had fought in the previous period, but also to apply military methods to the problems of everyday life, particularly to industry and to the trade unions. In these heated discussions, the sailors of the Baltic Fleet adopted a viewpoint very different from Trotsky's. At the elections to the 10th Party Congress, the Baltic Fleet voted solidly against its leaders. Trotsky, People's Commissar of War, under whose authority the Navy came, and Raskolnikov, chief of the Baltic Fleet, Trotsky and Raskolnikov were in agreement on the trade union question. The sailors sought to protest against the developing situation by abandoning the party en masse. According to information released by Sorin, Commissar for Petrograd, 5,000 sailors left the party in January 1921 alone. There is no doubt that the discussion taking place within the party at this time had profound effect on the masses. It overflowed the narrow limits the party sought to impose on it. It spread to the working class as a whole, to the soldiers and to the sailors. Heated local criticism acted as a general catalyst. The proletariat had reasoned quite logically. If discussion and criticism were permitted to party members, why should they not be permitted to the masses themselves who had endured all the hardships of the Civil War? In his speech to the 10th Congress, published in the Congress Proceedings, Lenin voiced his regret at having, quote, permitted, end quote, such a discussion. Quote, we have certainly committed an error, end quote, he said, quote, in having authorized this debate. Such a discussion was harmful just before the spring months that would be loaded with such difficulties, end quote. Petrograd on the eve of Kronstadt. Despite the fact that the population of Petrograd had diminished by 2/3, the winter of 1920-21 proved to be a particularly hard one. Food in the city had been scarce since February 1917, and the situation had deteriorated from month to month. The town had always relied on foodstuffs brought in from other parts of the country. During the Revolution, the rural economy was in crisis in many of these regions. The countryside could not feed the capital the countryside could only feed the capital to a very small extent. The catastrophic condition of the railways made things even worse. The ever-increasing antagonism between town and country created further difficulties everywhere. To these partly unavoidable factors must be added the bureaucratic degeneration of the administration and the rapacity of the state organs for food supply. Their role in feeding the population was actually a negative one. If the population of Petrograd did not die of hunger during this period, it was above all thanks to its own adaptability and initiative. It got food where it could. Barter was practiced on a large scale. There was still some food to be had in the countryside despite the smaller area under cultivation. The peasant would exchange this produce for the goods he lacked: boots, petrol, salt, matches. The population of the towns would try and get hold of these commodities in any way it could. They alone had real value. Jesus Christ. It would take them to the countryside. In exchange, people would carry back a few pounds of flour or potatoes. As we have mentioned before, the few trains, unheated, would be packed with men carrying bags on their shoulders. En route, the trains would often have to stop because they had run out of fuel. Passengers would get off and cut logs for the boilers. Marketplaces had officially been abolished, but in nearly all the towns, there was semi-tolerated illegal markets where barter was carried out. Such markets existed in Petrograd. Suddenly, in the summer of 1920, Zinoviev issued a decree forbidding any kind of commercial transactions. The few small shops still open were closed and their doors sealed. However, the state apparatus was in no position to supply the towns. From this moment on, famine could no longer be attenuated by the initiative of the population. It became extreme. In January 1921, according to information published by the Commons, the state supplies of the town of Petrograd, workers in metal smelting factories were allocated rations of 800 grams of black bread a day, shock workers in other factories 600 grams, workers with AV cards 400 grams, other workers 200 grams. Black bread was the staple diet of the Russian people at this time. But even these official rations were distributed irregularly in even smaller amounts than those stipulated. Transport workers would receive, at irregular intervals, the equivalent of 700 to 1,000 calories a day. Lodgings were unheated. There was a great shortage of both clothing and footwear. According to official statistics, working-class wages in 1920 in Petrograd were only 9% of those in 1913. The population was drifting away from the capital. All who had relatives in the country had rejoined them. The authentic proletariat remained till the end, having the most slender connections with the countryside. This fact must be emphasized in order to nail the official lies seeking to attribute the Petrograd strikes that were soon to break out to peasant elements, quote, insufficiently steeled in proletarian ideas, end quote. The real situation was the very opposite. A few workers were seeking refuge in the countryside. The bulk remained. There was certainly no exodus of peasants into the starving towns. A few thousand soldiers of the labor armies, Trudar Maitzes, then in Petrograd, did not modify this picture. It was the famous Petrograd proletariat, the proletariat which had played such a leading role in both previous revolutions, that was finally to resort to the classical weapons of the class struggle, the strike. The first strike broke out at the Traubochny factory on the 23rd of February 1921. On the 24th, the strikers organized a mass demonstration in the street. Zinoviev sent detachments of Karsanti, student officers, against them. The strikers tried to contact the Finnish barracks. Meanwhile, the strikes were spreading. The Baltiski factory stopped work. Then the La Ferma factory and a number of others. The Skorokhod shoe factory, the Admiraltysky factory, the Borman and Metallishsky plants, and finally, on the 28th of February, the great Putilov works itself. The strikers were demanding measures to assist food supplies. Some factories were demanding the reestablishment of the local markets, freedom to travel within a radius of 30 miles of the city, and the withdrawal of the militia detachments holding the road around the town. But side by side with these economic demands, several factories were putting forward more political demands: freedom of speech and of the press, the freeing of working-class political prisoners. In several big factories, party spokesmen were refused a hearing. Confronted with the misery of the Russian workers who were seeking an outlet to their intolerable conditions, the servile party committee in Zinoviev, who, according to numerous accounts, was behaving in Petrograd like a real tyrant, could find no better methods of persuasion than brute force. Pukhov, quote, official, end quote, historian of the Kronstadt revolt, wrote that, quote, decisive class measures were needed to overcome the enemies of the revolution who were using a non-class conscious section of the proletariat in order to wrench power from the working class and its vanguard, the Communist Party, end quote. Pukhov, the Kronstadt footnote, Pukhov, the Kronstadt Rebellion of 1921, State Publishing House, Young Guard edition, 1931, in the series, quote, Stages of the Civil War, end of footnote. On the 24th of February, the party leaders set up a special general staff called the Committee of Defense. It was composed of 3 people: Lachevich, Anzelovich, and Avrov. They were to be supported by a number of technical assistants. In each district of the town, a similar committee of 3, Troika, was to be set up, composed of the local party organizer, the commander of the party battalion of the local territorial brigade, and of a commissar from the officers' training corps. Similar committees were organized in the outlying districts. These were composed of the local party organizer, the president of the executive of the local Soviet, and the military commissar for the district. On the 24th of February, the Committee of Defense proclaimed a state of siege in Petrograd. All circulation on the streets was forbidden after 11 p.m., as were all meetings and gatherings, both out of doors and indoors, that had not been specifically permitted by the Defense Committee. Quote, all infringements would be dealt with according to military law, end quote. The decree was signed by Avrov, later shot by the Stalinists, commander of the Petrograd military region, by Lachevich, who later committed suicide, a member of the War Council, and by Bolin, later shot by the Stalinists, commander of the fortified Petrograd district. A general mobilization of party members was decreed. Special detachments were created to be sent to, quote, special destinations, end quote. At the same time, the militia detachments guarding the roads in and out of the town were withdrawn. Then the strike leaders were arrested. On the 26th of February, the Kronstadt sailors, naturally interested in all that was going on in Petrograd, sent delegates to find out about the strikes. The delegation visited a number of factories. It turned to Kronstadt on the 28th. The same day, the crew of the battleship Petropavlovsk, having discussed the situation, voted the following resolution. Footnote. This isn't the resolution, it's a footnote. This resolution was subsequently endorsed by all the Kronstadt sailors in General Assembly and by a number of groups of Red Army Guards. It was also endorsed by the whole working population of Kronstadt in General Assembly. It became the political program of the insurrection. It therefore deserves a careful analysis. Okay, here we are. Here's the resolution. Quote, having heard the reports of the representatives sent by the General Assembly of the fleet to find out about the situation in Petrograd, the sailors demand 1. Immediate new elections to the Soviets. The present Soviets no longer express the wishes of the workers and peasants. The new elections should be by secret ballot and should be preceded by free electoral propaganda. You know, I think I actually have this document on the YouTube channel. The Petropavlovsk resolution. Anyway, demand 2. Freedom of speech and of press for workers and peasants, for the anarchist and for the left socialist parties. 3. The right of assembly and freedom of trade union and peasant organization. 4. The organization at the latest, the 10th of March 1921, of a conference of non-party workers, soldiers, and sailors of Petrograd, Kronstadt, and the Petrograd district. 5. The liberation of all political prisoners of the socialist parties and of all imprisoned workers and peasant soldiers and sailors belonging to working class and peasant organizations. The election of a commission to look into the dossiers of all those detained in prison and concentration camps. 7. The abolition of all political sections in the armed forces. No political party should have privileges for the propagation of its ideas or receive state subsidies to this end. In the place of the political sections, various cultural groups should be set up, deriving resources from the state. 8. The immediate abolition of the militia detachments set up between towns and countryside. 9. The equalization of rations for all workers except those engaged in dangerous or unhealthy jobs. 10. The abolition of party combat detachments in all military groups. The abolition of party guards in factories and enterprises. If guards are required, they should be nominated taking into account the views of the workers. 11. The granting to the peasants of freedom of action on their own soil and of the right to own cattle, provided they look after them themselves and do not employ hired labor. 12. We request that all military units and officer trainee groups associate themselves with this resolution. 13. We demand that the press give proper publicity to this resolution. 14. We demand the institution of mobile workers' control groups. 15. We demand that handicraft production be authorized, provided it does not utilize wage labor. End quote. Analysis of the Kronstadt program. The Kronstadt sailors and the Petrograd strikers knew quite well that Russia's economic status was at the root of the political crisis. Their discontent was caused both by the famine and by the whole evolution of the political situation. The Russian workers were increasingly disillusioned by their greatest hope, the Soviets. Daily they saw the power of a single party substituting itself for that of the Soviets, a party, moreover, that was degenerating rapidly through the exercise of absolute power, and which was already riddled by careerists. It was against the monopoly exercised by this party in all fields of life that the working class sought to react. Point 1 of the Kronstadt Revolution expressed an idea shared by the best elements of the Russian working class. Totally, quote, Bolshevized, end quote, Soviets no longer reflected the wishes of the workers and peasants. Hence the demand for new elections to be carried out according to the principle of full equality for all working class political tendencies. Such a regeneration of the Soviets would imply the granting to all working class tendencies the possibility for expressing themselves freely without fear of calumny or extermination. Hence, quite naturally, there followed the idea of freedom of expression, of the press, of assembly, and of organization contained in point 2. We must stress that by 1921, the class struggle in the countryside had been fought to a virtual standstill. The vast majority of the kulaks had been dispossessed. It is quite wrong to claim that the granting of basic freedoms to the peasants, as demanded in point 3, would have meant restoring political rights to the kulaks. It was only a few years later that the peasants were exhorted to, quote, enrich themselves, end quote, and this by Bukharin, then an official party spokesman. The Kronstadt Revolution had the merit of stating things openly and clearly, but it was breaking no new ground. Its main ideas were being discussed everywhere, for having in one way or another put forward precisely such ideas, workers and peasants were already filling the prisons and the recently set up concentration camps. The men of Kronstadt did not desert their comrades. Point 6 of their resolution shows that they intended to look into the whole juridical apparatus. They already had serious doubts as to its objectivity as an organ of their rule. The Kronstadt sailors were thereby showing a spirit... Sorry, try to kill a bee. I mean, not a bee, a fly. Don't kill bees. Bees for life. They already had serious doubts as to the juridical apparatus's objectivity. The Kronstadt sailors were thereby showing a spirit of solidarity in the best working class tradition. In July 1917, Kerensky had arrested a deputation of the Baltic fleet that had come to Petrograd. Kronstadt had immediately sent a further deputation to insist on their release. In 1921, this tradition was being spontaneously renewed. Points 7 and 10 of the resolution attacked the political monopoly being exercised by the ruling party. The party was using state funds in an exclusive and uncontrolled manner to extend its influence both in the party and in the both in the army and in the police. Point 9 of the resolution demanded full equal rations for all workers. This destroys Trotsky's accusation of 1938, according to which, quote, the men of Kronstadt wanted privileges while the country was hungry, end quote. The accusation was made in answer to a question put to Trotsky by Weddelin Thomas a member of the New York Commission of Inquiry into the Moscow trials. End footnote. Point 14 clearly raised the question of workers' control. Both before and during the October Revolution, this demand had provoked a powerful echo among the working class. The Kronstadt sailors understood quite clearly that the real control had escaped from the hands of the rank and file. They sought to bring it back. The Bolsheviks, meanwhile, sought to vest all control in the hands of a special commissariat, the Rabkrin, Workers' and Peasants' Inspection. Footnote. Whom has history vindicated in this matter? Shortly before his second stroke, Lenin was to write, quote, "Let us speak frankly. The inspection now enjoys no authority whatsoever. Everybody knows that there is no worse institution than our inspection," end quote. This was said a bare 18 months after the suppression of Kronstadt. It is worth pointing out that Stalin had been the chief of the Rabkrin, from 1919 till the spring of 1922, when he became General Secretary of the party. He continued to exercise a strong influence over Rabkrin even after he had formally left it. Lenin, incidentally, had voiced no objection to Stalin's appointment or activities in this post. That only came later. Lenin had in fact defended both Stalin and Rabkrin against some of Trotsky's more far-sighted criticisms. See Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet Armed, pages 47 to 48. End footnote. Point 11 reflected the demand of the peasants to whom the Kronstadt sailors had remained linked, as had, as a matter of fact, the whole of the Russian proletariat. The basis of this link is to be found in the specific history of Russian industry. Because of feudal backwardness, Russian industry did not find its roots in petty handicraft. In their great majority, the Russian workers came directly from the peasantry. This must be stressed. The Baltic sailors of 1921 were, it is true, closely linked with the peasantry, but neither more nor less so than had been the sailors of 1917. In their resolution, the Kronstadt sailors were taking up once again one of the big demands of October. They were supporting those peasant claims demanding the land and the right to own cattle for those peasants who did not exploit the labor of others. In 1921, moreover, there was another aspect to this particular demand. It was an attempt to solve the food question, which was becoming desperate. Under the system of forced requisition, the population of the towns was literally dying of hunger. Why, incidentally, should the satisfaction of these demands be deemed, quote, tactically correct, end quote, when advocated by Lenin in March 1921, and, quote, counter-revolutionary, end quote, when put forward by the peasants themselves a few weeks earlier? What was so counter-revolutionary about the Kronstadt program? What could justify the crusade launched by the party against Kronstadt? A workers' and peasants' regime that did not wish to base itself exclusively on lies and terror had to take account of the peasantry. It need not thereby have lost its revolutionary character. The men of Kronstadt were not alone, moreover, in putting forward such demands in 1921. Makhno's followers were still active in the Ukraine. This revolutionary peasant movement was evolving its own ideas and methods of struggle. The Ukrainian peasantry had played a predominant role in chasing out the feudal hordes. It had earned the right itself to determine the forms of its social life. Despite Trotsky's categorical and unsubstantiated assertions, the Makhno movement was in no sense whatever a kulak movement. Kubanin, the official Bolshevik historian of the Makhno movement, shows statistically in a book edited by the party's Historical Institute that the Makhno movement at first appeared and developed most rapidly in precisely those areas where the peasants were poorest. The Makhno movement was crushed before it had a chance to showing in practice its full creative abilities. The fact that during the Civil War it had been capable of creating its own specific forms of struggle leads one to guess that it could have been capable of a lot more. As a matter of fact, in relation to agrarian policy, nothing was to prove more disastrous than the zigzags of the Bolsheviks. In 1931, 10 years after Kronstadt, Stalin was to decree his famous, quote, liquidation of the kulaks, end quote. This resulted in an atrocious famine and in the loss of millions of human lives. Let us finally consider point 15 of the Kronstadt resolution, demanding freedom for handicraft production. This was not a question of principle. For the workers of Kronstadt, handicraft production was to compensate for an industrial production that had fallen to naught. Through this demand, they were seeking a way out of their intolerable economic plight. 3. Mass meetings and Bolshevik slanders. Mass meetings. The Kronstadt Soviet was due to be renewed on the 2nd of March. A meeting of the 1st and 2nd battleship sections had been planned for the 1st of March. The notification had been published in the official journal of the city of Kronstadt. The speakers were to include Kalinin, president of the All-Russian Executive of Soviets, Kuzmin, political commissar to the Baltic Fleet. When Kalinin arrived, he was received with music and flags. All military honors were accorded him. 16,000 people attended the meeting. Party member Vasiliev, president of the local Soviet, took the chair. The delegates who had visited Petrograd the previous day gave their reports. The resolution adopted on the 28th of February by the crew of the battleship Petropavlovsk was distributed. Kalinin and Kuzmin opposed the resolution. They proclaimed that, quote, Kronstadt did not represent the whole of Russia, end quote. Nevertheless, the mass assembly adopted the Petropavlovsk resolution. In fact, only 2 people voted against it, Kalinin and Kuzmin. The mass assembly decided to send a delegation of 30 workers to Petrograd to study the situation on the spot. It was also decided to invite delegates from Petrograd to visit Kronstadt so that they would get to know what the sailors were really thinking. A further mass meeting was planned for the following day, grouping delegates from ships' crews and from Red Army groups, from state institutions, from the dockyards and factories, and from the trade unions, to decide on the procedure of new elections to the local Soviet. At the end of the meeting, Kalinin was allowed to regain Petrograd in all safety. The following day, on the 2nd of March, the delegates' meeting took place in the House of Culture. According to the official Kronstadt Izvestia, the appointment of delegates had taken place properly. The delegates all insisted that the elections be carried out in a loyal and correct manner. Kuzmin and Vasiliev spoke first. Kuzmin stated that the party would not relinquish power without a fight. Their speeches were so aggressive and provocative that the assembly ordered them to leave the meeting and put them under arrest. Other party members were, however, allowed to speak at length during the debate. The meeting of delegates endorsed by an overwhelming majority of the Petropavlovsk resolution. It then got down to examining in detail the question of elections to the new Soviet. These elections were to, quote, prepare the peaceful reconstruction of the Soviet regime, end quote. The work was constantly interrupted by rumors, spreading through the assembly, to the effect that the party was preparing to disperse the meeting by force. The situation was extremely tense. The Provisional Committee. Because of the threatening speeches of the representatives of the state power, Kuzmin and Vasiliev, and fearing retaliation, the assembly decided to form a Provisional Revolutionary Committee to which it entrusted the administration of the town and the fortress. The committee held its first session aboard the Petropavlovsk, the battleship in which Kuzmin and Vasiliev were being detained. The leading body of the Assembly of Delegates all became members of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee. They were Petrochenko, chief quartermaster of the battleship Petropavlovsk. Yakovenko, liaison telephonist to the Kronstadt section. Osasov, boilerman in the battleship Sebastopol. Arkhipov, chief engineer. Perepelkin, electrician in the battleship Sebastopol. Patruchev, chief electrician in the Petropavlovsk. Kaupolov, head male nurse. Verchinin, sailor in the Sebastopol. Tukin, worker in the electrotechnical factory. Romanenko, docks maintenance worker. Orechin, headmaster of the 3rd Labor School. Volk, sawmill worker. Pavlov, worker in marine mining shop. Boykev, head of the building section of the Kronstadt fortress. Kilgast, harbor pilot. The committee of the members of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee were sailors with a long service. This contradicts the official version of the Kronstadt events, which seeks to attribute the leadership of the revolt to elements recently joining the Navy and having nothing in common with the heroic sailors of 1917 to 1919. The first proclamation of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee stated, quote, "We are concerned to avoid bloodshed. Our aim is to create through the joint efforts of town and fortress the proper conditions for regular and honest elections to the new Soviet," end quote. Later that day, under the leadership of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, the inhabitants of Kronstadt occupied all strategic points in the towns, taking over the state establishments, the staff headquarters, and the telephone and wireless buildings. Committees were elected in all battleships and regiments. At about 9 p.m., most of the forts and most detachments of the Red Army had rallied. Delegates coming from Oranienbaum had also declared their support for the Provisional Revolutionary Committee. The same day, the Izvestia print shops were occupied. On the morrow, the 3rd of March, the men of Kronstadt published the first issue of the Izvestia of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee. Footnote: the entire life of this short-lived journal was reprinted as an appendix to a book, Pravda o Kronstadt, The Truth About Kronstadt, published in Prague in 1921. End of footnote. In it one reads, quote, "The Communist Party, master of the state, has detached itself from the masses. It has shown itself incapable of getting the country out of its mess. Countless incidents have recently occurred in Petrograd and Moscow, which show clearly that the party has lost the confidence of the working masses. The party is ignoring working-class demands because the party believes that these demands are the result of counter-revolutionary activity. In this, the party is making a profound mistake," end quote. Bolshevik slanders. Meanwhile, Moscow radio is broadcasting as follows, quote, "Struggle against the White Guard plot," end quote. End quote. Just like other White Guard insurrections, the mutiny of ex-General Kozlovsky and the crew of the battleship Petropavlovsk has been organized by Entente spies. This is clear from the fact that the French paper Le Monde published the following message from Helsingfors 2 weeks before the revolt of General Kozlovsky. Quote, "We are informed from Petrograd that as the result of the recent Kronstadt revolt, the Bolshevik military authorities have taken a whole series of measures to isolate the town and to prevent the soldiers and sailors of Kronstadt from entering Petrograd." End quote, end quote. Quote, "It is therefore clear that the Kronstadt revolt is being led from Paris. The French counter-espionage is mixed up in the whole affair. History is repeating itself. The socialist revolutionaries, who have their headquarters in Paris, are preparing the ground for an insurrection against the Soviet power. The ground prepared, their real master, the Tsarist general, appeared. The history of Kolchak installing his power in the wake of that of the socialist revolutionaries is being repeated, end quote. Radio Stanzia Moskva and Radio Vestnik Rosta Moskva, the 3rd of March, 1921. The two antagonists saw facts differently. Their outlooks were poles apart. The call issued by Moscow's radio was obviously coming from the Politburo's top leaders. It had Lenin's approval, who must have been fully aware of what was happening at Kronstadt. Even assuming that he had to rely on Zinoviev for information, whom he knew to be cowardly and liable to panic, it is difficult to believe that Lenin misunderstood the real state of affairs. On the 2nd of March, Kronstadt had sent an official delegation to see Lenin. It would have been enough to cross-question it in order to ascertain the true situation. Lenin, Trotsky, and the whole party leadership knew quite well that it was no mere, quote, generals, end quote, revolt, end quote. Excuse me. It was no mere, quote, generals' revolt, end quote. Sorry, when there's an apostrophe after an S, I sometimes think it's the end of a quote, but it's not the end of the quote. Why then invent this legend about General Kozlovsky, leader of the mutiny? The answer lies in the Bolshevik outlook, an outlook at times so blind that it could not see that lies were as likely to prove nefarious as to prove helpful. The legend of General Kozlovsky opened the path to another legend, that of the Wrangel officer allegedly conspiring with Trotsky in 1928-29. It in fact opened the path to the massive lying of the whole Stalin era. Anyway, who was this general? Get out of here. Anyway, who was this General Kozlovsky, denounced by the official radio as the leader of the insurrection? He was an artillery general and had been one of the first to defect to the Bolsheviks. He seemed devoid of any capacity as a leader. At the time of the insurrection, Kozlovsky happened to be in command of the artillery at Kronstadt. The communist commander of the fortress had defected. Kozlovsky, according to the rules prevailing in the fortress, had to replace him. He in fact refused, claiming that as the fortress was now under the jurisdiction of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, the old rules no longer applied. Kozlovsky remained, it is true, in Kronstadt, but only as an artillery specialist. Moreover, after the fall of Kronstadt, in certain interviews granted to the Finnish press, Kozlovsky accused the sailors of having wasted precious time on issues other than the defense of the fortress. He explained this in terms of their reluctance to resort to bloodshed. Later, other officers of the garrison were also to accuse the sailors of military incompetence and of complete lack of confidence in their technical advisors. Kozlovsky was the only general to have been present at Kronstadt. This was enough for the government to make use of Kozlovsky's name. The men of Kronstadt did, up to a point, make use of the military know-how of certain officers in the fortress at the time. Some of these officers may have given the men advice out of sheer hostility to the Bolsheviks, but in their attack on Kronstadt, the government forces were also making use of ex-Tsarist officers. On the one side, there was Kozlovsky, Solomianov, and Arkaniov. On the other, ex-Tsarist officers and specialists of the old regime, such as Tolkachevsky, Kamenev, and Arov. On neither side were these officers an independent force. Four, effects on the party rank and file. On the 2nd of March, the Kronstadt sailors, aware of their rights, their duties, and moral authority vested in them by their revolutionary past, attempted to set the Soviets on a better path. They saw how distorted they had become through the dictatorship of a single party. On the 7th of March, the general government launched its military onslaught against Kronstadt. What had happened between these two dates? In Kronstadt, the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, enlarged during a mass meeting by the co-option of 5 new members, had started to reorganize social life in both town and fortress. It decided to arm the workers of Kronstadt to ensure the internal protection of the town. It decreed the compulsory re-election within 3 days of the leading trade union committees and of the Congress of Trade Unions, in which bodies it wished to vest considerable powers. Rank-and-file members of the Communist Party were showing their confidence in the Provisional Revolutionary Committee by mass desertion from the party. A number of them formed a Provisional Party Bureau, which issued the following appeal, quote, that makes where I live sound way cooler than it is. Where am I? Quote, this is a number of the deserters from the Bolshevik Party formed a Provisional Party Bureau which issued the following appeal. Quote, give no credence to the absurd rumors spread by provocateurs seeking bloodshed, according to which responsible party comrades are being shot, or to rumors alleging that the party is preparing an attack against Kronstadt. This is an absurd lie spread by agents of the Entente, seeking to overthrow the power of the Soviets. The Provisional Party Bureau considers re-elections to the Kronstadt Soviet to be indispensable. It calls on all its supporters to take part in these elections. The Provisional Party Bureau calls on all its supporters to remain at their post and to create no obstacles to the measures taken by the Provisional Revolutionary Committee. Long live the power of the Soviets. Long live international working class unity. Signed on behalf of the Provisional Party Bureau of Kronstadt, Elaine, ex-commissar for supplies, Pervalchin, ex-president of the local executive committee, Kabinov, ex-president of the regional trade union bureau. End quote. The Stalinist historian Pukhov, referring to this appeal, declared that, quote, it can only be considered a treasonable act and an opportunist step towards an agreement with the leaders of the insurrection, who are obviously playing a counter-revolutionary role. End quote. Pukhov admits that this document had, quote, a certain effect, end quote, on the rank and file of the party. According to Pukhov, 780 party members in Kronstadt left the party at this time. Footnote. Pukhov, The Kronstadt Rebellion of 1921, in the series Stages of the Civil War, Young Guard Edition, 1931, State Publishing House, Moscow. Some of those resigning from the party sent letters to the Kronstadt Izvestia, giving reasons for their action. The teacher Denisov wrote, quote, I openly declare to the Provisional Revolutionary Committee that as from gunfire directed at Kronstadt, I no longer consider myself a member of the party. I support the call issued by the workers of Kronstadt, all power to the Soviets, not to the party. End quote. A military group assigned to the special company dealing with discipline also issued a declaration, quote, we, the undersigned, joined the party, believing it to express the wishes of the working masses. In fact, the party has proved itself an executioner of workers and peasants. This is revealed quite clearly by recent events in Petrograd. These events show up the face of the party leaders. The recent broadcasts from Moscow show clearly that the party leaders are prepared to resort to any means in order to retain power. We ask that henceforth we no longer be considered party members. We rally to the call issued by the Kronstadt garrison in its resolution of the 2nd of March. We invite other comrades who have become aware of the error of their ways publicly to recognize the fact. Signed, Gutman, Yefimov, Kudryavtsev, Andreev. Izvestia of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, 7th of March, 1921, end quote. The Communist Party members in the, quote, RIF, end quote, fort, published the following resolution, quote, during the last 3 years, many greedy careerists have flocked to our party. This has given rise to bureaucracy and has gravely hampered the struggle for economic reconstruction. Our party has always faced up to the problem of the struggle against the enemies of the proletariat and of the working masses. We publicly declare that we intend to continue in the future our defense of the rights secured by the working class. We will allow no white guard to take advantage of this difficult situation confronting the Republic of Soviets. At the first attempt directed against its power, we will know how to retaliate. We fully accept the authority of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, which is setting itself the objective of creating Soviets genuinely representing the proletarian and working masses. Long live the power of the Soviets, the real defenders of working class rights. Signed, the chairman of the Secretary of the Meeting of Communists in Fort Rif. Izvestia of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, 7th of March, 1921. End quote. Were such declarations forcibly abstracted from party members by the regime of terror directed against party members allegedly reigning in Kronstadt at the time? Not a shred of evidence has been produced to this effect. Throughout the whole insurrection, not a single imprisoned communist was shot. And this despite the fact that among the prisoners were men responsible for the fleet, such as Kausman and Battis. The vast majority of Communist Party members were in fact left entirely free. In the, quote, Izvestia, end quote, of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee for the 7th of March, one can read under the heading, quote, we are not seeking revenge, end quote, the following note, quote, the prolonged oppression to which the party dictatorship has submitted the workers has provoked a natural indignation among the masses. This has led in certain places to boycotts and sackings directed against the relatives of party members. This must not take place. We are not seeking revenge. We are only defending our interest as workers. We must act cautiously. We must only take action against those who sabotage or those who through lying propaganda seek to prevent a reassertion of working class power and rights, end quote. In Petrograd, however, humanist ideas of a rather different kind were prevailing. As soon as the arrest of Kausman and Vasiliev were learned, the Defense Committee ordered the arrest of the families of all Kronstadt sailors known to be living in Petrograd. A government plane showered Kronstadt with leaflets saying, quote, the Defense Committee announces that it has arrested and imprisoned the families of sailors as hostages for the safety of communist comrades arrested by the Kronstadt mutineers. We refer specifically to the safety of Fleet Commissar Kausman and Vasiliev, the president of the Kronstadt Soviet. If a hair of their heads is touched, the hostages will pay with their lives, end quote. Izvestia of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, 5th of March, 1921. Well, that's charming. The Provisional Revolutionary Committee replied with the following radio message, quote, in the name of the Kronstadt garrison, the Provisional Revolutionary Committee of Kronstadt insists on the liberation within 24 hours of the families of the workers, sailors, and Red soldiers arrested as hostages by the Petrograd Soviet. The Kronstadt garrison assures you that in the city of Kronstadt, party members are entirely free and that their families enjoy absolute immunity. We refuse to follow the example of the Petrograd Soviet. We consider such methods, even when conducted by ferocious hatred, as utterly shameful and degrading. Signed, Petrochenko, sailor, president of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, Kilgast secretary. End quote. To refute rumors according to which party members were being ill-treated, the Provisional Revolutionary Committee set up a special commission to investigate the cases of the imprisoned communists. In its issue on the 4th of March, the, quote, Izvestia, end quote, of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee announced that a party member would be attached to the commission. It is doubtful if this body ever got to work, as 2 days later the bombardment of Kronstadt began. The Provisional Revolutionary Committee did, however, receive a party delegation. It granted it permission to visit the prisoners in the Petropavlovsk. The prisoners had been allowed to hold meetings among themselves and to edit a wall newspaper, Zaykovsky, quote, Kronstadt from 1917 to 1921, end quote. There was no terror in Kronstadt. Under very difficult and tragic circumstances, the, quote, rebels had done their utmost to apply the basic principles of working-class democracy. If many rank-and-file communists decided to support the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, it was because this body expressed the wishes and aspirations of the working people. In retrospect, this democratic self-assertion of Kronstadt may appear surprising. It certainly contrasted with the actions and frame of mind prevailing among the party leaders in Petrograd and Moscow. They remained blind, deaf, and totally lacking in understanding of what Kronstadt and the working masses of the whole of Russia really wanted. I think there was supposed to be an end of a quotation mark somewhere, but I can't find it. Catastrophe could still have been averted during these tragic days. Why then did the Petrograd Defense Committee use such abusive language? The only conclusion an objective observer can come to is that it was done with the deliberate intention of provoking bloodshed, thereby, quote, teaching everyone a lesson, end quote, as to the need for absolute submission to the central power. 5. Threats, bribes, and skirmishes. Threats and bribes. On the 5th of March, the Petrograd Defense Committee issued a call to the rebels, quote, you are being told fairy tales when they tell you that Petrograd is with you or that the Ukraine supports you. These are impertinent lies. The last sailor in Petrograd abandoned you when he learned that you were led by generals like Kozlovsky. Siberia and the Ukraine support the Soviet power. Red Petrograd laughs at the miserable efforts of a handful of white guards and socialist revolutionaries. You are surrounded on all sides. A few hours more will lapse, and then you will be compelled to surrender. Kronstadt has neither bread nor fuel. If you insist, we will shoot you like partridges. At the last minute, all those generals, the Kozlovskys, the Bortzers, and all that riffraff, the Petrochenkos and the Turins will flee to Finland, to the White Guards. And you, rank-and-file soldiers and sailors, where will you go then? Don't believe them when they promise to feed you in Finland. Haven't you heard what happened to Wrangel's supporters? They are transported to Constantinople. There they are dying like flies in their thousands of hunger and disease. This is the fate that awaits you unless you immediately take a grip of yourselves. Surrender immediately. Don't waste a minute. Collect your weapons and come to us. Disarm and arrest your criminal leaders, and in particular the Tsarist generals. Whoever surrenders immediately will be forgiven. Surrender now. Signed, the Defense Committee. In reply to these threats from Petrograd, the Provisional Revolutionary Committee issued a final appeal. Quote, to all, comrades, workers, red soldiers, and sailors, here in Kronstadt we know full well how much you and your wives and your children are suffering under the iron rule of the party. We have overthrown the party-dominated Soviet. The Provisional Revolutionary Committee is today starting elections to a new Soviet. It will be freely elected, and it will reflect the wishes of the whole working population and of the garrison, and not just those of a handful of party members. Our cause is just. We stand for the power of the Soviets, not for that of the party. We stand for freely elected representatives of the toiling masses. Deformed Soviets dominated by the party have remained deaf to our pleas. Our appeals have been answered with bullets. The workers' patience is becoming exhausted, so now they are seeking to pacify you with crumbs. On Zinoviev's orders, the militia barrages have been withdrawn. Moscow has allocated 10 million gold rubles for the purchase abroad of foodstuffs and other articles of first necessity. But we know that the Petrograd proletariat will not be bought over in this way. Over the heads of the party, we hold out to you the fraternal hand of revolutionary Kronstadt. Comrades, you are being deceived, and truth is being distorted by the basest of calumnies. Comrades, don't allow yourselves to be misled. In Kronstadt, power is in the hands of the sailors, of the Red Soldiers, and of the revolutionary workers. It is not in the hands of White Guards commanded by General Kozlovsky, as Moscow radio lyingly asserts. Signed, the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, end quote. Foreign communists were in Moscow and Petrograd at the time of the revolt. They were in close contact with leading party circles. They confirmed that the government had made hasty purchases abroad. Even chocolate was bought, which had always been a luxury in Russia. Moscow and Petrograd had suddenly changed their tactics. The government had a better grasp of psychological war than had the men at Kronstadt. It understood the corrupting influence of white bread on a starving population. It was in vain that Kronstadt asserted that crumbs would not buy the Petrograd proletariat. The government's methods had undoubted effect, especially when combined with vicious repression directed against the strikers. Support in Petrograd. Part of the Petrograd proletariat continued to strike during the Kronstadt events. Pukov, the party historian himself, admits this. The workers were demanding the liberation of the prisoners. In certain factories, copies of the Izvestia of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee were found plastered on the walls. A lorry even drove through the streets of Petrograd scattering leaflets from Kronstadt. In certain enterprises, for instance the State Printing Works, number 26, the workers refused to adopt a resolution condemning the Kronstadt sailors. At the, quote, arsenal, end quote, factory, the workers organized a mass meeting on the 7th of March, the day the bombardment of Kronstadt began. This meeting adopted a resolution of the mutinous sailors. It elected a commission which was to go from factory to factory agitating for a general strike. Strikes were continuing in the biggest factories of Petrograd. Putilov, Baltisky, Abukov, Nievskaya, Manufactura, etc. The authorities sacked the striking workers, transferred the factories to the authority of the local troikas, three-man committees who proceeded to selective rehiring of workers. Okay. Other repressive measures were also taken against the strikers. Strikes were also starting in Moscow, in Nizhny Novgorod, and in other cities. But here too the prompt delivery of foodstuffs combined with calumnies to the effect that Tsarist generals were in command at Kronstadt had succeeded in sowing doubts among the workers. The Bolsheviks' aim had been achieved. The proletariat of Petrograd and of the other industrial cities was in a state of confusion. The Kronstadt sailors, who had been hoping for the support of the whole of working-class Russia, remained isolated, confronting a government determined to annihilate them, whatever the cost. First skirmishes. On the 6th of March, Trotsky addressed an appeal by radio to the Kronstadt garrison. Quote, Quote, the workers' and peasants' government has decided to reassert its authority without delay, both over Kronstadt and over the mutinous battleships, and to put them at the disposal of the Soviet Republic. I therefore order all those who have raised a hand against the socialist fatherland immediately to lay down their weapons. Those who resist will be disarmed and put at the disposal of the Soviet command. The arrested commissars and other representatives of the government must be freed immediately. Only those who surrender unconditionally will be able to count on the clemency of the Soviet Republic. I am meanwhile giving orders that everything be prepared to smash the revolt and the rebels by force of arms. The responsibility for the disasters which will affect the civilian population must fall squarely on the heads of the White Guard insurgents. End quote. Well, signed Trotsky, President of the Military Revolutionary Council of the Soviet Republic. Kamenev Glavkom, Commanding Officer. Footnote, this Kamenev was an ex-Tsarist officer now collaborating with the Soviet government. He was a different Kamenev from the one shot by the Stalinists in 1936. On the 8th of March, a plane flew over Kronstadt and dropped a bomb. On the following days, government artillery continued to shell the fortress and neighboring forts, but met with stiff resistance. Aircraft dropped bombs, which provoked such fury among the civilian population that they started firing back. The Provisional Revolutionary Committee had to order the defenders not to waste their ammunition. By 1921, the Kronstadt garrison had been markedly reduced. Figures issued by the General Staff of the defenders put the number at 3,000. Gaps between infantrymen defending the perimeter were at least 32 feet wide. Stocks of ammunition and shells were also limited. During the afternoon of the 3rd of March, the Revolutionary Committee had met in conference together with certain military specialists. A military defense committee was set up which prepared to plan to defend the fortress. But when the military advisors had proposed an assault in the direction of Oranienbaum, there were food stocks at Spass-Etelenia. The Provisional Revolutionary Committee refused. It was not putting its faith in the military capacity of the sailors, but in the moral support of the whole of proletarian Russia. Until the first shot had been fired, the men of Kronstadt refused to believe that the government would militarily attack them. This is no doubt why the Provisional Revolutionary Committee had not set out to prevent the approach of the Red Army by breaking the ice around the foot of the fortress. For much the same reasons, fortified barrages were not set up along the probable line of attack. Kronstadt was right. Militarily, they could not win. At best, they could have held a fortnight. This might have been important, for once the ice had melted, Kronstadt could have become a real fortress, capable of defending itself. Nor must we forget that their human reserves were infinitesimal, compared with the numbers the Red Army could throw into battle. Six, demoralization in the Red Army. What was morale like in the Red Army at this time? In an interview given to Krasnaya Gazeta, Dybenko described how all the military units participating in the assault on Kronstadt had to be reorganized. Footnote: Old Bolshevik, President Dybenko. I guess they're talking about Dybenko. Old Bolshevik, president of the Centralbolt, Central Committee of the Sailors of the Baltic Fleet, in July 1917. After October Revolution, member of the First Soviet of People's Commissars, together with Antonov, Ovchinko, and Krylenko, was put in charge of Army and Navy. End footnote. This was an absolute necessity. During the first day of military operations, the Red Army had shown that it did not wish to fight against the sailors, against the Bratchiki, little brothers, as they were known at the time. Amongst the advanced workers, the Kronstadt sailors were known as people most devoted to the revolution. And anyway, the very motives that were driving Kronstadt to revolt existed among the ranks of the Red Army. Both were hungry and cold, poorly clad and poorly shod, and this was no mean burden in the Russian winter, especially when what was asked of them was to march and fight on ice and snow. During the night of the 8th of March, when the Red Army attack against Kronstadt started, a terrible snowstorm was blowing over the Baltic. Thick fog made the tracks almost invisible. The Red Army soldiers wore long white blouses, which hid them well against the snow. This is how Pukhov described morale in Infantry Regiment 561 in an official communique. The regiment was approaching Kronstadt from the Oranian bomb side. Quote, at the beginning of the operation, the 2nd Battalion had refused to march. With much difficulty and thanks to the presence of communists, it was persuaded to venture on the ice. As soon as it reached the 1st South Battery, a company of the 2nd Battalion surrendered. The officers had to return alone. The regiment stopped. Dawn was breaking. We were without news of the 3rd Battalion, which was advancing towards South Batteries 1 and 2. The battalion was marching in file and was being shelled by artillery from the forts. It then spread out and veered to the left of Fort Miliutin, from which red flags were being waved. Having advanced a further short distance, it noticed that the rebels had fitted machine guns on the forts and were offering them the choice of surrendering or being massacred. Everybody surrendered except the battalion commissar and 3 or 4 soldiers who turned back on their steps. End quote. On the 8th of March, Ublanov, commissar of the sector, On the 8th of March, Ublanov, commissar for the northern sector, wrote to the Petrograd Party, quote, I consider it my revolutionary duty to clarify you as to the state of affairs on the northern sector. It is impossible to send the army into a second attack on the forts. I have already spoken to comrades Lechevich, Avrov, and Trotsky about the morale of the Kursantes, cadet officers deemed most fit for battle. I have to report the following tendencies. The men wish to know the demands of Kronstadt. They want to send delegates to Kronstadt. The number of political commissars in this sector is far from sufficient. End quote. Army morale was also revealed in the case of the 29th Brigade of the 27th Omsk Division. The division comprised 3 regiments. It had shown its fighting capacities in the struggle against Kolchak. On the 12th of March, the division was brought to the Kronstadt front. The Orkane Regiment refused to fight against Kronstadt. The following day, the 2 other regiments of the same division, the soldiers organized impromptu meetings where they discussed what attitude to take. 2 of the regiments had to be disarmed by force, and the, quote, revolutionary, end quote, tribunal posed heavy sentences. There were many similar cases. Not only were the soldiers unwilling to fight against their class brothers, but they were not prepared to fight on the ice in the month of March. Units had been brought in from other regions of the country where by mid-March the ice was melting already. They had little confidence in the solidity of the Baltic ice. Those who had taken part in the first assault had seen that the shells from Kronstadt were opening up enormous holes in its surface, in which the unfortunate government troops were being engulfed. These were hardly encouraging scenes. All this contributed to the failure of the first assaults against Kronstadt. Reorganization. The regiments to be used in the final assault against Kronstadt were thoroughly reorganized. Groups that had shown any sympathy towards Kronstadt were disarmed and transferred to other units. Some were severely punished by the Revolutionary Tribunal. Party members were mobilized and allocated to various battalions for purposes of propaganda and for reporting back on unsure elements. Between the 8th and 15th of March, while the cannons exchanged fire over the ice at Kronstadt, the 10th Party Congress was held in Moscow. The Congress dispatched 300 delegates to the front, among them Voroshilov, Bubnov, Zatowski, Rokhimovich, and Pyatakov. The, quote, delegates, end quote, were nominated, quote, political commissars, end quote, and appointed to the military section of the Cheka, or to, quote, special commissions for the struggles against desertion, end quote. Some just fought in the ranks. The revolutionary tribunals were working overtime. Pukov describes how, quote, they would vigorously react to all unhealthy tendencies. Troublemakers and provocateurs were punished according to their deserts, end quote. The sentences would immediately be made known to the workers. Sometimes they would even be published in the papers. But despite all the propaganda, all the reorganization, all the repression, the soldiers retained their doubts. On the 14th of March, there were further acts of insubordination. Regiment 561, reorganized on the 8th of March, still refused to march. Quote, we will not fight against our brothers from the same, quote, Stanlitsas, end quote, they proclaimed. Stanlitsas. I think it's what's being said there. I don't know. Footnote. Stanlitsas are Cossack villages. Regiment 560, also composed of Cossacks and Ukrainians, was fighting on the side of Kronstadt. Small groups of Red Army men surrendered to the rebels and started fighting on their side. Witnesses described how some units lost half their men before even entering the line of fire of the insurgents. They were being machine gunned from the rear, quote, to prevent them surrendering to the rebels, end quote. Official sources described how issues of Kronstadt Izvestia were being read with great interest in the Red Army. So were the leaflets distributed by the Kronstadt rebels. Special political commissions were set up to prevent such material from entering the barracks, but this had an opposite effect from the one expected. Party organizations throughout the country were mobilized. Intensive propaganda was carried out among the troops in the rear. The human and material resources available to the government were far greater than those available to Kronstadt. Trains were daily bringing new troops to Petrograd. Many were being sent from the Kyrgyz and Bashkir lands, i.e., were composed of men as far removed as possible from the, quote, Kronstadt frame of mind, end quote. As to the defenders of Kronstadt, their forces were not only diminishing numerically through losses sustained in fighting, but they were more and more exhausted. Badly clad and half-starving, the Kronstadt rebels remained at their guns almost without relief for just over a week. At the end of this period, many of them could hardly stand. 7. The final assault. Aware of these facts and having taken all necessary measures in relation to organization, supplies, and improvement in morale, Tukhachevsky, commander of the 7th Army, issued his famous proclamation of 15th of March. He ordered that Kronstadt be taken by all-out assault in the night of 16th to 17th of March. Entire regiments of the 7th Army were equipped with hand grenades, white blouses, shears for cutting barbed wire, and with small sleighs for carrying machine guns. Tukhachevsky's plan was to launch a decisive attack from the south and then to capture Kronstadt by a massive simultaneous assault from 3 different sections. On the 16th of March, the southern group opened its artillery barrage at 14:20 hours. At 17 hours, the northern group also started shelling Kronstadt. The Kronstadt guns answered back. The bombardment lasted 4 hours. Aircraft then bombed the city, with a view to creating panic among the civilian population. In the evening, the artillery bombardment ceased. The Kronstadt searchlights swept over the ice looking for the invaders. Towards midnight, the government troops had taken up their position and started to advance. At 2:45 a.m., the northern force had occupied Fort 7, abandoned by the Kronstadt defenders. At 4:30 a.m., government troops attacked Forts 4 and 6, but suffered very heavy losses from the Kronstadt artillery. At 6:40 a.m., government officer cadets finally captured Fort 6. At 5 a.m., the southern force launched an attack on the forts facing them. The defenders, overwhelmed, fell back towards the city. A fierce and bloody battle then broke out in the streets. Machine guns were used at very close range. The sailors defended each house, each attic, each shed. In the town itself, they were reinforced by the workers' militias. The attacking troops were for a few hours thrown back towards the forts and suburbs. The sailors reoccupied the Mechanical Institute, which had been captured earlier by the 80th Government Brigade. The street fighting was terrible. Red Army soldiers were losing their officers. Red Army men and defending troops were mixing in indescribable confusion. No one quite knew who was on which side. The civilian population of the town tried to fraternize with the government troops. Despite the shooting, leaflets of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee were still being distributed. To the bitter end, the sailors were trying to fraternize. Throughout the 17th of March, the fighting raged on. By the evening, the northern group had occupied most of the forts. Street fighting continued throughout the night and well into the following morning. One by one, the last forts, Miliutin, Konstantin, and Ubritchev, fell. Even after the last one had been occupied, isolated groups of defenders were still desperately fighting back with machine guns. Near the Tolbukin lighthouse, a final group of 150 sailors put up a desperate resistance. The balance sheet. Figures issued by the military health authorities of the Petrograd district and relating to the period between 3rd and 21st of March spoke of 4,127 wounded and 527 killed. These figures do not include the drowned or the numerous wounded left to die on the ice. Footnote. So numerous were the latter that the Finnish Foreign Ministry started discussions with Bersin, the Russian ambassador, with a view to joint frontier guard patrols clearing the corpses from the ice. The Finns feared that hundreds of bodies would be washed onto the Finnish shores after the ice had melted. End footnote. Nor do they include the victims of the revolutionary tribunals. We do not even have approximate figures as to the losses on the Kronstadt side. They were enormous, even without the reprisal massacres that later took place. Perhaps one day the archives of the Cheka and of the revolutionary tribunals will reveal the full and terrible truth. This is what Pukov, quote, official and, quote, Stalinist historian of the revolt says on the matter, quote, while steps were being taken to reestablish normal life and as the struggle against rebel remnants was being pursued, the revolutionary tribunals of the Petrograd military district were carrying out their work in many areas. Severe proletarian justice was being meted out to all traitors to the cause. The sentences were given much publicity in the press and played a great educational role, end quote. These quotations from the official sources refute Trotskyist lies that, quote, the fortress was surrounded and captured with insignificant losses, end quote. Footnote. On the 10th of September 1937, Trotsky wrote in La Lutte ouvrière, quote, the legend that would have it that Kronstadt 1921 was a great massacre, end quote. End footnote. In the night of the 17th to 18th of March, part of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee left Kronstadt. Some 8,000 people, some sailors, and the most active part of the civilian population moved towards Finland in permanent exile. When the Red Army, defenders of the, quote, Soviet, end quote, power, finally entered Kronstadt, they did not re-establish the Kronstadt Soviet. Its functions were taken over by the political section of the Secretariat of the new assistant commander of the fortress. The whole Red Fleet was profoundly reorganized. Thousands of Baltic sailors were sent to serve in the Black Sea, in the Caspian, and in Siberian naval stations. According to Pukov, quote, the less reliable elements, those infected with Kronstadt spirit, were transferred. Many only went reluctantly. This measure contributed to the purification of an unhealthy atmosphere, end quote. In April, the new naval command started an individual check. Quote, a special commission dismissed 15,000 sailors in, quote, non-essential, end quote, i.e. non-specialized categories, V, G, and D, as well as sailors not considered reliable from a political point of view, end quote. After the physical annihilation of Kronstadt, its very spirit had to be eradicated from the fleet. 8. What they said at the time. Quote, revolts by workers and peasants have shown that their patience has come to an end. The uprising of the workers is near at hand. The time has come to overthrow the bureaucracy. Kronstadt has raised for the first time the banner of the third revolution of the toilers. The autocracy has fallen. The constituent assembly has departed to the region of the damned. The bureaucracy is crumbling, end quote. Izvestia of the Kronstadt Provisional Revolutionary Committee, Etapi Revolucji, Stages of the Revolution, March 12, 1921. Quote, in the bourgeois newspapers you can read that we brought up Chinese, Kalmuk, and other regiments against Udimich and Kronstadt. This is, of course, a lie. We brought up our youth. The storming of Kronstadt was indeed symbolic. Kronstadt, as I said, was about to pass into the hands of French and English imperialism, end quote. Leon Trotsky, speech delivered at Second Congress of Communist Youth International, July 14, 1921. The First 5 Years of the Communist International, Pioneer Publishers, 1945, page 312. The Anarchists. Did the Kronstadt sailors put forward their demands and resolutions by themselves, or were they acting under the influence of political groups which might have suggested slogans to them? Anarchist influence is often incriminated when this subject is described. How sure can one be of the matter? Among members of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, as among the Kronstadters in general, there were certainly individuals claiming to be anarchists, but if one bases oneself on documentary evidence, as we have sought to do throughout this study, one must conclude that there was no direct intervention by anarchist groups. The Menshevik Dan, Theodore Dan, who was in prison for a while in Petrograd with a group of Kronstadt rebels, tells us in his memoirs that Perepelkin, one of the members of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, was close to anarchism. He also tells us that the Kronstadt sailors were both disillusioned and fed up with Communist Party policy, and that they spoke with hatred about political parties in general. In their eyes, the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries were as bad as the Bolsheviks. all were out to seize power and would later betray the people who had vested their confidence in them. According to Dan, the conclusion of the sailors, disappointed with political parties, was, quote, "You are all the same. What we need is anarchism, not a power structure," end quote. The anarchists, of course, defend the Kronstadt rebels. It seems likely to us that had any of their organizations really lent a hand in the insurrection, the anarchist press would have mentioned the fact. In the anarchist press of the time, however, there is no mention of such help. For instance, Yartchuk, an old anarchist syndicalist, who before October had enjoyed considerable authority amongst the population and sailors of Kronstadt, mentions no such anarchist role in his pamphlet devoted to the 1921 uprising. Yartchuk, this isn't a footnote, in 1926 Yartchuk became a communist and returned to Russia. We must consider his judgment as fairly conclusive evidence. End of footnote. We must consider his judgment as fairly conclusive evidence. At the time of the insurrection, the anarchists were already being persecuted all over the country. Isolated libertarians and the few remaining anarchist groupings were undoubtedly, quote, morally, end quote, on the side of the insurgents. This is shown, for instance, in the following leaflet addressed to the working class of Petrograd, quote, "The Kronstadt revolt is a revolution. Day and night you can hear the sound of the cannon. You hesitate to intervene directly against the government to divert its forces from Kronstadt, although the cause of Kronstadt is your cause. The men of Kronstadt are always in the forefront of rebellion. After the Kronstadt revolt, let us see the revolt of Petrograd, and after you let anarchism prevail," end quote. Four anarchists then in Petrograd, Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, Perkis, and Petrovsky, foresaw a bloody outcome to events. On the 5th of March, they sent the following letter to the Petrograd Council for Labor and Defense. Quote, "Is it not only impossible, but in fact criminal to keep quiet at the present time? Recent developments compel us anarchists to give our opinion on the present situation. The discontent and ferment in the minds of the workers and sailors are the results of circumstances which deserve serious attention from us. Cold and famine have provoked discontent, while the absence of any possibility of discussion or criticism drive the workers and sailors to seek an outlet to their discontent. The fact that a workers' and peasants' government uses force against workers and sailors is even more important. It will create a reactionary impression in the international labor movement and will therefore harm the cause of the social revolution. Bolshevik comrades, think while there is still time. Don't play with fire. You are about to take a decisive step. We propose the following to you. Nominate a commission of 6, of which 2 should be anarchists, to go to Kronstadt to solve the differences peacefully. In the present circumstances, this is the most rational way of doing things. It will have an international revolutionary significance," end quote. These anarchists certainly did their duty, but they acted on their own, and there is nothing to show that they were organizationally linked with the rebels in any way. Moreover, the very fact that they proposed this kind of mediation suggests that they were not in direct contact with the sailors, who had themselves sent a deputation to Petrograd, through which it would have been possible to negotiate. And if, in the, quote, Petropavlovsk resolution, end quote, we find the demand of freedom of speech and freedom of publication for anarchists, this merely shows that the Kronstadters of 1921 had retained their ideas and traditions of before October. Before October, both Bolsheviks and anarchists had considerable influence in Kronstadt. Footnote. According to the testimony of well-known Bolsheviks such as Flerovsky and Razkolnikov, end footnote. In the summer of 1917, at a meeting of the Petrograd Soviet, Trotsky had been able to answer the Menshevik leader, Tseretelli, quote, "Yes, the Kronstadters are anarchists, but during the final stage of the revolution, the reactionaries who are now inciting you to exterminate Kronstadt will be preparing ropes to hang both you and us, and it will be the Kronstadters who will fight to the last to defend us," end quote. The anarchists were well known in Kronstadt as revolutionaries. That is why the rebels, when they spoke of opening the doors of the Soviets to the different socialist tendencies, had first thought of anarchists as well as the left socialist revolutionaries. The most important of the demands of the Petropavlovsk resolution were those calling for democratic rights for the workers and those peasants not exploiting the labor of others, and the demand calling for the abolition of the monopoly of party influence. These demands were part of the program of other socialist tendencies already reduced to illegality. The anarchists agreed with these demands and were not the only ones to be putting them forward. On the other hand, the Kronstadters repeatedly insisted that they were, quote, for Soviet power, end quote. A small minority of Russian libertarians, the, quote, Soviet anarchists, end quote, were known to support the idea of close collaboration with the Soviets, which were already integrated into the state machine. The Makhnovist movement, on the other hand, which was not exclusively anarchist, although under the strong personal influence of Makhno, and anarchists since the age of 16, did not speak of, quote, Soviet power, end quote, as something to be defended. Its slogan was, quote, free Soviets, end quote, i.e. Soviets were different political different political tendencies might coexist without being vested with state power. The Kronstadters believed that the trade unions had an important role to play. This idea was by no means an exclusively anarchist one. It was shared by the left socialist revolutionaries and by the workers' opposition, Kollontai and Shliapnikov, in the Communist Party itself. Later, other oppositional communist tendencies, like the Sopranovites, who I think were the democratic centralists, which is a kind of a funny name because it makes it sound as if that what they were advocating for was centralism. What they were adding, their emphasis was on the democratic side of the democratic centralist equation, or the name. I guess the equation works too. But yeah, the Sopranovites were the democratic centralist in the communist opposition. In short, the idea was the hallmark of all those who sought to save the Russian Revolution through proletarian democracy and through an opposition to the one-party monopoly which had started dominating and was now replacing all other tendencies. We may conclude by saying that anarchism had an influence on the Kronstadt insurrection to the extent that it advocated the idea of proletarian democracy. The Mensheviks. The Mensheviks had never carried much weight amongst the sailors. The number of Menshevik deputies to the Kronstadt Soviet bore no real relation to their influence in the fleet. The anarchists who after the second election had only 3 or 4 deputies to the Soviet enjoyed a far greater popularity. This paradoxical situation arose from the lack of organization among the anarchists and also from the fact that in 1917 the differences between Bolshevism and anarchism were hardly perceptible to the masses. Many anarchists at that time saw Bolshevism as a kind of Bakuninized Marxism, end quote. Footnote. This idea was later developed by Herman Sandomierski, a, quote, Soviet anarchist, end quote, in an article published in the Moscow Izvestia on the occasion of Lenin's death. End footnote. The Mensheviks, at least their official faction, although fundamentally hostile to Bolshevism, were not in favor of an armed struggle against the state power. Because of this, they were hostile to armed insurrection. Footnote. In fact, during Denikin's offensive of 1919, they had told their members to enter the Red Army. End footnote. They tried to play the role of legal opposition both in the Soviets and in the trade unions, opposed both to the dictatorship of the proletariat and to the dictatorship of a single party, and convinced that a stage of capitalist development still confronted Russia. They felt that armed interventions would only prevent the democratic forces in Russia from establishing themselves. They hoped that once the armed struggle had come to an end, the regime would be compelled to follow a course of democratic transformation. On the 7th of March 1921, during the Kronstadt insurrection, the underground Petrograd Committee of the Mensheviks published the following leaflet, quote, "To the workers, Red soldiers, and Khorasantis of Petrograd, stop the slaughter. The guns are thundering, and the communists who claim to be a workers' party are shooting the sailors of Kronstadt." I guess this is a long quote. We don't know all the details about what has happened at Kronstadt, but we do know that the Kronstadters have called for free elections to the Soviets and for the release of arrested socialists and arrested non-party workers and soldiers. They have called for the convening on March 10th of a non-party conference of workers, Red Soldiers, and sailors to discuss the critical situation of Russia. A genuine workers' power should have been able to clarify the real causes of the Kronstadt events. It should have discussed things openly with the workers and sailors of Kronstadt in front of the whole of working-class Russia. Instead, the Bolsheviks have proclaimed a state of siege and have machine-gunned the soldiers and sailors. Comrades, we must not just sit and listen to the sound of guns. Each salvo may destroy dozens of human lives. We must intervene and put an end to this massacre. Insist that military operations against the soldiers and workers of Kronstadt be ended immediately. Insist that the government start immediate negotiations with Kronstadt with the participation of Petrograd factory delegates. Elect delegates forthwith to participate in these discussions. Stop the slaughter." End quote. The Central Committee of the Mensheviks had also published a leaflet. This proclaimed that, quote, "What was necessary was not a policy of violence toward the peasantry, but a policy of conciliation toward the peasantry. Power should really be in the hands of the working masses. To this end, new and free elections to the Soviets were essential. What was needed was that workers' democracy, much talked about, but of which one couldn't see the slightest trace." End quote. Socialistический Vestnik, the official organ of Russian social democracy, published abroad, assessed the Kronstadt insurrection as follows, quote, "It is precisely the masses themselves who until now have supported Bolshevism, who have now taken the initiative in a decisive struggle against the present regime." End quote. The paper considered the Kronstadt slogans to be Menshevik ones and added that Mensheviks, quote, "had all the greater right to be pleased about it, in view of the fact that their party had played no role in the insurrection, given the total lack of any Menshevik organization in the fleet." End quote. Martov, the leader of Russian Menshevism, was already out of Russia. In an article in Freiheit, published on May 1st, 1921, Martov denied that either Mensheviks or social revolutionaries had played any part in the insurrection. The initiative, Martov felt, was coming from the sailors who were breaking with the Communist Party at the organizational level, but not at the level of principles. Pukov quotes another leaflet signed by one of the numerous groups of Mensheviks. It said, quote, "Down with the lines of the counter-revolution. Where are the real counter-revolutionaries? They are the Bolsheviks, the commissars, those who speak of, quote, Soviet power," end quote. Against them, the real revolution is rising up. We must support it. We must come to the rescue of Kronstadt. Our duty is to help Kronstadt. Long live the revolution. Long live the Constituent Assembly," end quote. The Menshevik Central Committee declined all responsibility for slogans put forward by such dissident groupings. The Right SRs. The call for the convening of the Constituent Assembly was the central theme of the propaganda of the right-wing socialist revolutionaries. In Revolutionная Russia, their party organ, which in March 1921 was being published abroad, Viktor Chernov, ex-president of the dissolved Constituent Assembly and leader of the Right SRs, wrote, quote, "All those who want to find a way out of the disgusting blood-stained Bolshevik dictatorship, all those who wish to tread the path of freedom must stand up around Kronstadt and come to its help. The crown of democracy must be the Constituent Assembly," end quote. Now, Chernov was fully aware that in number 6 of the Kronstadt Izvestia, the rebel sailors had written, quote, "The workers and peasants will go forward. They will leave behind them the Utrednika, pejorative form for the Constituent Assembly, and its bourgeois regime. They will also leave behind them the Communist Party dictatorship with its Cheka and its state capitalism, which has seized the masses by the throat and is threatening to throttle them," end quote. When Chernov discussed these lines of the Kronstadters, he attributed them to an ideological survival of past Bolshevik influence. By personal and political temperament, Chernov was diametrically opposed to the Mensheviks. With his political friends, he launched a passionate appeal to the sailors. Quote, "The Bolsheviks killed the cause of liberty and democracy when they counterposed in the popular mind the idea of Soviets to the idea of the Constituent Assembly. Instead of seeing the Soviets as a support for the Constituent Assembly as a powerful link between the Assembly and the country, they raised the Soviets against the Assembly and thereby killed both the Soviets and the Assembly. This is what you must understand, deceived workers, soldiers, and sailors. Let your slogan, quote, free elections to the Soviets, end quote, reverberate as a call to a march from the Soviets to the Constituent Assembly, end quote." Chernov went even further. From a private ship, he sent the following radio message to the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, quote, "The President of the Constituent Assembly, Viktor Chernov, sends fraternal greetings to the heroic sailor, soldier, and worker comrades for the third time since 1905, who for the third time since 1905 are shaking off the yoke of tyranny. Acting as an intermediary, he proposes, with the help of Russian cooperative organizations now abroad, to send men to ensure the feeding of Kronstadt. Let me know what you need and how much you need. I am prepared to come personally and to place both my forces and my authority at the disposal of the popular revolution. I have confidence in the final victory of the working people. From every corner we are receiving news that the masses are ready and willing to rise to the name of the Constituent Assembly. Don't be trapped into negotiations with the Bolsheviks. They will only enter into such negotiations in order to gain time and to concentrate around Kronstadt those formations of the privileged Soviet military corps of which they can be sure. Glory to those who were the first to raise the flag of popular liberation. Down with the despotism of both left and right. Long live liberty and democracy," end quote. At the same time, a second appeal was sent to Kronstadt by a special courier from the, quote, deputation abroad of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, end quote. Quote, "The party has abstained from any type of putschism. In Russia, it has lately put the brakes on the upsurges of popular anger, while frequently trying, through the pressure of workers and peasant opinion, to compel the Kremlin dictators to concede to the demands of the people. But now that popular anger has overflowed, now that the flag of popular revolution has been proudly hoisted over Kronstadt, our party is offering the rebels the help of all the forces it can muster in the struggle for liberty and democracy. The SRs are prepared to share your fate and to win or die in your ranks. Let us know how we can help you. Long live the People's Revolution. Long live free Soviets and the Constituent Assembly," end quote. To these concrete proposals, Chernov received on the 3rd of March 21st the following answer by radio. Quote, "The Provisional Revolutionary Committee of the city of Kronstadt has received the greetings of Comrade Chernov, dispatched from Reval. To all our brothers abroad, we express our gratitude for their sympathy. We thank Comrade Chernov for suggestions, but ask him not to come for the time being until the matter has been clarified. For the time being, we are noting his proposal. Signed, Petrochenko, President of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee," end quote. The Bolsheviks claim that the Provisional Revolutionary Committee consented in principle to Chernov's arrival. They also claim that Chernov made his offer to send provisions to the Kronstadt conditional on the rebels launching the slogan of the Constituent Assembly. On the 20th of March 1921, the communist Komarov declared at a meeting of the Petrograd Soviet that the Provisional Revolutionary Committee had asked Chernov to wait 12 days, during which time the food situation in Kronstadt would have become such that it would be possible to launch the slogan asked for by the SRs. Komarov claimed that this information had been obtained in the course of the cross-questioning of Perepelkin and a member of the the questioning of Perepelkin, a member of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee who had fallen into Bolshevik hands. Perepelkin was even alleged to have said that the president of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee had secretly sent a positive answer to Chernov. The sailor Perepelkin was shot, and his, quote, confessions, end quote, cannot be verified, but in prison just before he had met the Menshevik Dan and mentioned no such thing to him, although during their joint exercise periods, Perepelkin had provided Dan with many details concerning the insurrection. One is led to believe that already in 1921, Bolshevik, quote, justice, end quote, knew how to concoct confessions. In an article published in January 1926 in Znamia Borby, organ of the left SRs, Petrochenko, president of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, confirms the answers given to Chernov by the committee. He explains that the committee itself could not deal with this question. It proposed to hand the problem over to the newly elected Soviet. Petrochenko adds, quote, I am describing things as they took place in reality and independent of my own political opinion, end quote. As for Chernov, he denies having posed conditions for the rebels. He claims openly to have supported the slogan of the Constituent Assembly, quote, convinced that sooner or later the rebels would have adopted it, end quote. The left SRs. In the June 1921 issue of their paper Znamia, published abroad, this is how the left SRs outlined their program. Quote, the essential aim of the left internationalist SR party is the reconstruction of the Soviets and the restoration of genuine Soviet power. We are aiming at the permanent reestablishment of the violated Constitution of the Soviet Republic as adopted on June 10, 1918 at the 5th All-Russian Congress of Soviets. The peasantry, which is the backbone of the working population in Russia, should have the right to dispose of its fate. Another essential demand is the reestablishment of the self-activity and of the free initiative of the workers in the cities. Intensive labor cannot be demanded of men who are starving and half dead. First, they must be fed, and to this end it is essential to coordinate the interest of workers and peasants, end quote. The spirit of the Petropavlovsk resolution is undoubtedly very close to that of the left SR program. The left SRs, however, deny participation in the insurrection. In the same issue of Znamia, one of their Moscow correspondents writes, quote, at Kronstadt, there wasn't a single responsible representative of left populism. The whole movement developed without our participation. At the onset, we were outside of it, but it was nevertheless essentially left populist in outlook. Its slogans and its moral objectives are very close to our own, end quote. In the wish to establish historical truth, we will now quote two further authorized testimonies, that of Lenin and that of the sailor Petrochenko, one of the leaders of the insurrection. Lenin's view. In his article, The Tax in Kind, this is what Lenin has to say about Kronstadt. Footnote. Ida Mett's quotations from Lenin are wrongly attributed to his article on the tax in kind. This report was delivered at the 10th Party Congress on March 15, 1921. In fact, the quotations relate to an article on the food tax. That's a footnote from Solidarity. Quote, in the spring of 1921, mainly as a result of the failure of the harvest and the dying of cattle, the condition of the peasantry, which is extremely bad already as a consequence of the war and blockade, became very much worse. This resulted in political vacillation, which generally speaking expresses the very, quote, nature, end quote, of the small producer. The most striking expression of this vacillation was the Kronstadt mutiny. There was very little of anything that was fully formed, clear, and definite. We heard nebulous slogans about, quote, liberty, end quote, free trade, end quote, emancipation from serfdom, end quote, Soviets without the Bolsheviks, end quote, or new elections to the Soviets, or relief from, quote, party dictatorship, end quote, and so on and so forth. Both the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries declared the Kronstadt movement to be, quote, their own, end quote, Lenin. Viktor Chernov sent a runner to Kronstadt. On the proposal of this runner, the Menshevik Volk, one of the Kronstadt leaders, voted for the, quote, constituent, end quote. In a flash, with radio-telegraphic speed, one might say, the White Guards mobilized all their forces, quote, for Kronstadt, end quote. The White Guard military experts in Kronstadt, a number of experts, and not Kozlovsky alone, drew up a plan for a landing of forces at Oranienbaum, a plan which frightened the vacillating Menshevik socialist revolutionary non-party masses. For more than 50 Russian White Guard newspapers published abroad are conducting a furious campaign, quote, for Kronstadt, end quote. The big banks, all the forces of finance capital, are collecting funds to assist Kronstadt. The wise leader of the bourgeoisie and the landlords, the cadet Milyukov, is patiently explaining to the fool Viktor Chernov directly, and to Dan and Rozkov, who are in Petrograd jail for their connection with the Kronstadt Mensheviks, indirectly, that they indeed be in no hurry with their constituent, and that they can and must support the Soviets only without the Bolsheviks. Is this still Lenin? Fucking, the quotation marks aren't there, but this definitely isn't what... People. Don't you know I'm going to read this to my many adoring fans on YouTube, and I need to be able to say who's saying what? Of course, it is easy to be cleverer than conceited fools like Chernov, the hero of petty bourgeois phrases, or like Martov, the knight of Philistine reformism, painted to look like, quote, Marxism, end quote. Properly speaking, the point is not that Milyukov as an individual is cleverer, but that because of his class position, the party leader of the big bourgeoisie understands the class essence and political interaction of things more clearly than the leaders of the petty bourgeoisie, the Chernovs and the Martovs. The bourgeoisie is really a class force which inevitably rules under capitalism, both under a monarchy and in the most democratic republic, and which also inevitably enjoys the support of the world bourgeoisie. But the petty bourgeoisie, i.e. all of the heroes of the Second International and the, quote, 2.5, end quote, International, cannot, by the very economic nature of the case, be anything else than the expression of class impotence, hence the vacillation, phrases, and helplessness. When in his Berlin journal, Martov declared that Kronstadt not only adopted Menshevik slogans, but also proved that an anti-Bolshevik movement was possible, which did not entirely serve the interest of the White Guards, the capitalists, and the landlords, he served as an example of conceited Philistine Narcissus. He said in effect, quote, let us close our eyes to the fact that all the real White Guards greeted the Kronstadt mutineers and through the banks collected funds in aid of Kronstadt, end quote. Milyukov is right compared with the Chernovs and the Martovs, for he proposes real tactics for a real White Guard force, the force of the capitalists and landlords. He says in effect, quote, it doesn't matter whom we support, even the anarchists, any sort of Soviet government, as long as the Bolsheviks are overthrown, as long as shifting power can be brought about. It makes no difference to the right or to the left, to the Mensheviks or to the anarchists, as long as power shifts away from the Bolsheviks, end quote. As for the rest, quote, we, end quote, the Milyukovs, we shall give the anarchists, the Chernovs, and the Martovs a good slapping and kick them out, as was done to Chernov and Maisky in Siberia, to the Hungarian Chernovs and Martovs in Hungary, to Kautsky in Germany and Friedrich Adler and co. in Vienna. The real practical bourgeoisie fooled hundreds of these Philistine Narcissuses. The Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, and non-party people, and kicked them out scores of times in all revolutions in all countries. This is proved by history. It is corroborated by facts. The Narcissus will chatter. The Narcissuses will chatter. The Milyukovs and White Party Guards will act. The events of the spring of 1921 once again revealed the role of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks. They are helping the vacillating petty bourgeois element to recoil from the Bolsheviks. to cause a, quote, shifting of power, end quote, for the benefit of the capitalists and landlords. The Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionaries have not learnt to disguise themselves as, quote, non-party, end quote. That was all Lenin. And according to Solidarity, that is from his article on the food tax. Petrochenko's evidence. We'll finally quote the main passage of Petrochenko's evidence as published in his article in the Left SR paper Znamia Borby in January 1926. Quote, I have read the letters exchanged between the Left SR organization and the British Communists. In this correspondence, the question of the Kronstadt insurrection of 1921 is raised. As I was the president of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, I feel it a moral obligation briefly to throw some light on these events for the benefit of the Political Bureau of the Moscow Communist Party. Excuse me. Jesus Christ. As I was president of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, I feel a moral obligation briefly to throw some light on these events for the benefit of the Political Bureau of the British Communist Party. I know you get your information from Moscow. I also know that this information is one-sided and biased. It wouldn't be a bad thing if you were shown the other side of the coin. You have yourselves admitted that the Kronstadt insurrection of 1921 was not inspired from the outside. This recognition implies that the patience of the working masses, sailors, red soldiers, workers, and peasants had reached its final limit. Popular anger against the dictatorship of the Communist Party, or rather against its bureaucracy, took the form of an insurrection. This is how precious blood came to be spilt. There was no question of class or caste differences. There were workers on both sides of the barricades. The difference lay in the fact that the men of Kronstadt marched forward consciously and of their own free will, while those who were attacking them had been misled by the Communist Party leaders, and some were even acting against their own wishes. I can tell you more. The Kronstadters didn't enjoy taking up arms and spilling blood. What happened then to force the Kronstadters to speak the language of guns with the Communist Party bosses, daring to call themselves a, quote, workers' and peasants' government, end quote. The Kronstadt sailors had taken an active part in the creation of such a government. They had protected it against all the attacks of the Counterrevolution. They not only protected the gates of Petrograd, the heart of the world revolution, but they also formed military detachments for the innumerable fronts against the White Guards, starting with Kornilov and finishing with Generals Yudenich and Nikliudov. Sorry, I feel like a lot of the names that are historical names that are used in this are spelled differently than what you might be used to, so I might be pronouncing them wrong, or I'm almost definitely pronouncing them wrong. You are asked to believe that these same Kronstadters had suddenly become the enemies of the revolution. The, quote, workers and peasants, end quote, government denounced the Kronstadt rebels as agents of the Entente, as French spies, as supporters of the bourgeoisie, as SRs, as Mensheviks, etc., etc. It is astounding that the men of Kronstadt should suddenly have become the dangerous enemies just when real danger from the generals of the armed counter-revolution had disappeared, just when the rebuilding of the country had to be tackled, just when people were thinking of tasting the fruits of October, just when it was a question of showing the goods in their true color, of showing one's political baggage, i.e. when it was no longer a question of making promises but of sticking to them. People were beginning to draw up a balance sheet of revolutionary achievements. We hadn't dared dreamed about this during the Civil War, yet it is just at this point in time that the men of Kronstadt were found to be enemies. What crime had Kronstadt therefore committed against the revolution? As the Civil War subsided, the Petrograd workers thought it their right to remind the Soviet of that town that the time had come to remember their economic plight and to pass from a war regime to a regime of peace. The Petrograd Soviet considered this harmless and essential demand to be counter-revolutionary. It not only remained deaf and dumb to these claims, but it started resorting to home searches and arrest of workers, declaring them spies and agents of the Entente. These bureaucrats became corrupt during the Civil War at a time when no one dared resist them. They hadn't noticed that the situation had changed. The workers answered by resorting to strikes. The fury of the Petrograd Soviet then became like the fury of a wild animal. Assisted by oprichniks, it kept the workers hungry and exhausted. Footnote. The oprichniks were the personal guard of Ivan the Terrible, and at the same time his higher political police force. During the 7 years of their existence, from 1565 to 1572, they distinguished themselves by their ferocious activity. End footnote. It held them in an iron grip, driving them to work by all kinds of constraint. The Red soldiers and sailors, despite their sympathy with the workers, didn't dare rise in their defense. But this time the, quote, workers, end quote, peasants, end quote, government came unstuck about Kronstadt. Somewhat belatedly, Kronstadt had learned about the true state of affairs in Petrograd. You are therefore right, British comrades, when you say that the Kronstadt revolt was not the result of the activities of any one particular person. Furthermore, I would like you to know more about the alleged support of Kronstadt of counter-revolutionary foreign and Russian organizations. I repeat again that the uprising was not provoked by any political organization. I doubt they even existed at Kronstadt. The revolt broke out spontaneously. It expressed the wishes of the masses themselves, but both the civilian population and the garrison. This is seen in the resolutions adopted and in the composition of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, where one cannot detect the dominant influence of any anti-Soviet party. According to the Kronstadters, anything that happened or was done there was dictated by the circumstances of the moment. The rebels didn't place their faith in anyone. They didn't even place it in the hands of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee or in the hands of the assemblies of delegates, or in the hands of meetings or anywhere else. There was no question about this. The Provisional Revolutionary Committee never attempted anything in this direction, although it could have done. The committee's only concern was strictly to implement the wishes of the people. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? I cannot pass judgment. The truth is that the masses led the committee and not the other way around. Among us there were no well-known political figures of the kind who see everything 3 arcans deep and know all that needs to be done and how to get the most out of every situation. Footnote. Archine equals to Russian measure of length. It might be pronounced archine. End of footnote. The Kronstadters acted without predetermined plans or program, feeling their way according to circumstances and within the context of the resolutions they had adopted. We were cut off from the entire world. We didn't know what was going on outside Kronstadt, either in Russia or abroad. Some may possibly have drawn up their own blueprints for our insurrection, as usually happens. They were wasting their time. It is fruitless to speculate as to what would have happened if things had evolved differently, for the turn of events itself might have been quite different from what we were anticipating. One thing is certain, the Kronstadters didn't want the initiative to pass out of their hands. In their publications, the communists accuse us of accepting an offer of food and medicine from the Russian Red Cross in Finland. We admit we saw nothing wrong in accepting such an offer. But both the Provisional Revolutionary Committee and the Assembly of Delegates agreed to it. We felt that the Red Cross was a philanthropic organization, offering us disinterested help that could do us no harm. When we decided to allow the Red Cross delegation to enter Kronstadt, we led them blindfolded to our headquarters. At our first meeting, we informed them that we gratefully accepted their offer of help as coming from a philanthropic organization, but that we considered ourselves free of any undertakings towards them. We accepted their request to leave a permanent representative in Kronstadt to watch over the regular distribution to women and children of the rations which they were proposing to send us. Their representative, a retired naval officer called Wilken, remained in Kronstadt. He was put in a permanently guarded flat and couldn't even step outside without our permission. What danger could this man have represented? All he could see was the resolve of the garrison and of the civilian population of Kronstadt. Was this, quote, the aid of the international bourgeoisie, end quote, or did this aid perhaps lie in the fact that Viktor Chernov had sent us his greetings? Was this the, quote, support of both the Russian and international counterrevolution, end quote? Can you really believe that the men of Kronstadt were ready to throw themselves into the embrace of any anti-Soviet party? Remembering that when the rebels learned that the right wing was beginning to devise plans about their insurrection, they didn't hesitate to warn the workers about it. Remember the article of March 6 in the Kronstadt Izvestia, entitled, quote, "Gentlemen or Comrades," end quote, end quote. Section 9. Kronstadt, last upsurge of the Soviets, quote, "This luxury was really absolutely impermissible. By permitting such a discussion on the trade unions, we undoubtedly made a mistake and failed to see that in this discussion a question came to the forefront which, because of the objective conditions, should not have been in the forefront," end quote. Lenin, Report to the 10th Party Congress, March 8, 1921. Quote, "What the rebels of Kronstadt demanded was only that quote, "What the rebels of Kronstadt demanded was only what Trotsky had promised their elder brothers and what he and the party had been unable to give." Once again, a bitter and hostile echo of his own voice came back to him from the lips of other people, and once again he had to suppress it. End quote. Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet Armed. Trotsky's accusations. Taking everything into account, what was the Kronstadt uprising? Was it a counter-revolutionary insurrection? Was it a revolt without conscious counter-revolutionary objectives, but which was bound to open the doors to the counter-revolution? Or was it simply an attempt by the working masses to materialize some of the promise of October? Was the revolt inevitable? And was the bloody end to which it came also inevitable? We will conclude by trying to answer these questions. The accusations made against Kronstadt by the Bolsheviks in 1921 are exactly the same as those mentioned later by the Stalinist historian Pukhov in his book published in 1931. Trotsky repeated them. The Trotskyists still repeat them today. Trotsky's attitude on this question was, however, always somewhat embarrassed and awkward. He would issue his accusations by the dropper instead of proclaiming them once and for all. In 1937, when he discussed Kronstadt for the first time in writing, in his books on the Russian Revolution, he hardly ever dealt with the subject. He starts by saying that, quote, "The country was hungry and the Kronstadt sailors were demanding privileges. The mutiny was motivated by their wish for privileged rations," end quote. Such a demand was never put forward by the men of Kronstadt. In his later writings, Trotsky, having doubtless taken care to read more on the matter, was to abandon this particular accusation. What remains, however, is that he started his public accusations with a lie. In an article in the Belgian paper, Lutte Ouvrière, Trotsky wrote, quote, "From a class point of view, which, no offense to the eclectics, remains the fundamental criterion both in politics and in history, it is extremely important to compare the conduct of Kronstadt with that of Petrograd during these critical days. In Petrograd, too, the whole leading stratum of the working class had been skimmed off. Famine and cold reigned in the abandoned capital even more crudely than in Moscow. The paper of the Kronstadt rebels spoke of barricades in Petrograd, of thousands of people killed. Footnote. It is untrue that the paper of the Kronstadters, the Kronstadt Izvestia, ever spoke of, quote, thousands of people killed, end quote, in Petrograd. End of footnote. The press of the whole world was announcing the same thing. In fact, the exact opposite took place. The Kronstadt uprising did not attract the workers of Petrograd, it repelled the workers of Petrograd. The demarcation took place along class lines. The workers immediately felt that the Kronstadt rebels were on the other side of the barricades, and they gave their support to the government, end quote. Here again, Trotsky is saying things which are quite untrue. Earlier on, we showed how the wave of strikes had started in Petrograd and how Kronstadt had followed suit. It was against the strikers of Petrograd that the government had to organize a special general staff, the Committee of Self-Defense, the Committee of, Jesus Christ. Here again, Trotsky is saying things which are quite untrue. Earlier on, we showed how the wave of strikes had started in Petrograd and how Kronstadt had followed suit. It was against the strikers of Petrograd that the government had to organize a special general staff, the Committee of Defense. The repression was first directed against the Petrograd workers and against their demonstrations by the dispatch of armed detachments of Kursantes. Footnote. Kursantes are officer cadets. End footnote. But the workers of Petrograd had no weapons. They could not defend themselves as could the Kronstadt sailors. The military repression directed against Kronstadt certainly intimidated the Petrograd workers. The demarcation did not take place, quote, along class lines, end quote, but according to the respective strengths of the organs of repression. The fact that the workers of Petrograd did not follow those of Kronstadt does not prove that they did not sympathize with them, nor at a later date, when the Russian proletariat failed to follow the various, quote, oppositions, end quote, did this prove that they were in agreement with Stalin. In such instances, it was it was a question of the respective strengths of the forces confronting one another. In the same article, Trotsky repeats his points concerning the exhaustion of Kronstadt from the revolutionary point of view. Trotsky claims that whereas the Kronstadt sailors of 1917 and 1918 were ideologically at a much higher level than the Red Army, the contrary was the case by 1921. This argument is refuted by official Red Army documents. These admit that the frame of mind of Kronstadt had infected large layers of the army. Trotsky denounces those who attack him over Kronstadt over the belatedness of their strictures. Quote, the campaign around Kronstadt, end quote, Trotsky says, quote, is conducted in certain places with unrelenting energy. One might imagine that events took place yesterday and not 17 years ago, end quote. But 17 years is a very short period on any historical scale. We don't accept that to speak of Kronstadt is to, quote, evoke the days of the Egyptian pharaohs, end quote. Moreover, it appears logical to us to seek some of the roots of the great Russian catastrophe in this striking and symptomatic episode. After all, it took place at a time when the repression of the Russian workers was not being perpetrated by some Stalin or other, but by the flower of Bolshevism, by Lenin and Trotsky themselves. Seriously, to discuss the Kronstadt revolt is therefore not, as Trotsky claims, quote, to be interested in discrediting the only genuine revolutionary tendency, the only tendency never to have reneged its flag, never to have compromised with the enemy, never to have compromised with the enemy, the only tendency to represent the future, end quote. During the subsequent 17 years, Trotsky shed none of his hostility towards the rebels. Lacking arguments, Trotsky resorts to gossip. He tells us that, quote, at Kronstadt, where the garrison was doing nothing and only living on its past, demoralization had reached important proportions. When the situation became particularly difficult in famished Petrograd, the political bureau discussed several times whether to raise an internal loan in Kronstadt, where there still remained old stores of all sorts. But the Petrograd delegates would answer, quote, "They will give us nothing of their own free will. They speculate on cloth, coal, bread, for in Kronstadt all the old scum has raised its head again," end quote. This argument concerning, quote, "old stores of all sorts," end quote, is in bad faith. One need only recall the ultimatum to the Kronstadters issued by the Petrograd Defense Committee on March 5th, referred to elsewhere, quote, "You will be obliged to surrender. Kronstadt has neither bread nor fuel," end quote. What happened in the meantime to the said old stories? The said old stores. It says stories here, but that's a typo. Further information on this topic comes from the Kronstadt Izvestia. Kronstadt Izvestia. Is that spelled wrong too? Isn't there supposed to be a Z? Whatever. Where am I? Further information on this topic comes from the Kronstadt Izvestia. It describes the distribution to children of 1 pound of dried potatoes on presentation of ration vouchers 5 and 6. On March 8th, 4 liters of oats were distributed to last 4 days. And on March 9th, 1/4 pound of black biscuit made of flour and dried potato powder. On March 10th, the Regional Committee of Metal Workers decided to place at the disposal of the community the horse meat to which its members were entitled. During the insurrection, there was also distributed a tin of condensed milk per person. On one occasion, some meat preserves, and finally, to children only, 1/2 pound of butter. That, no doubt, is what Trotsky refers to as, quote, "old stores of all sorts," end quote. According to him, these might have been borrowed to alleviate the Great Russian Famine. We should add that before the insurrection, these, quote, "stores," end quote, were in the hands of communist functionaries, and that it was upon these people alone that consent to the proposed, quote, "loan," end quote, depended. The rank-and-file sailor who took part in the insurrection had no means open to him whereby he could have opposed the loan, even if he had wanted to. So much for the question of, quote, "stores," end quote, which in passing shows the worth of some of the accusations used against Kronstadt. To resort to such arguments in the course of a serious discussion, and consciously to substitute for such a discussion a polemic about the Spanish Revolution, shows up a serious flaw, the absence of valid arguments on the matter among the Bolsheviks, for Trotsky isn't the central figure in the repression of Kronstadt. Lenin and the Politburo directed the whole operation. The workers' opposition must also shoulder its share of responsibility. According to the personal testimony of foreign communists residing in Russia at the time, the workers' opposition didn't agree with the measures being taken against the rebels. But neither did the workers' opposition dare open its mouth for the defense of Kronstadt. At the 10th Party Congress, no one protested at the butchery of the rebels. The worker Lutvinov, a well-known member of the Central Executive Committee of the Soviets and one of the leaders of the workers' opposition, was sent to Berlin in March 1921 on a diplomatic mission. In reality, this was a form of political exile. He declared that, quote, The news published abroad concerning the Kronstadt events was greatly exaggerated. The Soviet government is strong enough to finish off the rebels. The slowness of the operation is to be explained by the fact that we wish to spare the population of Kronstadt. La Humanité, March 18th, 1921. Footnote. Litvinov committed suicide in Moscow in May 1924. Trotsky uses yet another argument against the rebels. He accuses them of seeking to take advantage of their revolutionary past. This is a most dangerous argument for anyone in opposition. Stalin was to use it against Trotsky and the old Bolshevik and the old Bolsheviks. It was only later that Stalin accused them of having been, from the very beginning of the revolution, the agents of the international bourgeoisie. During the first years of the struggle, he conceded that Trotsky had rendered great services to the revolution, but he would add that Trotsky had subsequently passed into the ranks of the Counterrevolution. One had to judge a man on what he did now. The example of Mussolini was constantly mentioned. However, there are many things that Trotsky is unable to explain. He cannot explain how Kronstadt and the whole Red Fleet came to renounce their ideological support for the government. He cannot explain the frame of mind of the communist elements in the fleet during the discussions on the trade union question. He cannot explain their attitude during the 8th All-Russian Soviet Congress elections or during the Second Communist Conference of the Baltic Fleet, which took place on the eve of the insurrection. These are, however, key points around which the discussion should center. When Trotsky asserts that all of those supporting the government were genuinely proletarian and progressive, whereas all others represented the peasant counter-revolution, we have a right to ask of him that he present us with a serious factual analysis in support of his contention. The unfurling of subsequent events showed that the revolution was being shunted onto a disastrously wrong track. This was first to compromise, then to destroy all its social, political, and moral conquests. Did the Kronstadt revolt really represent an attempt to guide the revolution along new lines? That is the crucial question one has to ask. Other problems should be seen as of secondary importance and flowing from this serious concern. It is certainly not the smashing of the Kronstadt revolt that put a brake to the course of the revolution. On the contrary, in our opinion, it was the political methods used against Kronstadt and widely practiced throughout Russia which contributed to the setting up, on the ruins of the social revolution, of an oligarchic regime which had nothing in common with the original ideas of the revolution. Footnote. In his last book, written in the tragic context of an unequal struggle with his mortal enemy, Trotsky made what was for him a great effort of being objective. This is what he says about Kronstadt. Quote, "The Stalinist school of falsification is not the only one that flourishes today in the field of Russian history. Indeed, it derives a measure of sustenance from certain legends built on ignorance and sentimentalism, such as the lurid tales concerning Kronstadt, Makhno, and other episodes of the revolution. Suffice it to say that what the Soviet government did reluctantly at Kronstadt was a tragic necessity. Naturally, the revolutionary government could not have, quote, presented, end quote, the fortress that protected Petrograd to the insurgent sailors only because a few dubious anarchists and SRs were sponsoring a handful of reactionary peasants and soldiers in rebellion. Similar considerations were involved in the case of Makhno and other potentially revolutionary elements that were perhaps well-meaning but definitely ill-acting," end quote. Stalin by Trotsky. The Bolshevik interpretations. In 1921, the Bolshevik government claimed that Kronstadt had rebelled according to a preconceived plan. This particular interpretation was based on a note published in certain French newspaper, Le Matin, L'Echo de Paris, on February 15th. This note announced the uprising and led to the claim that the uprising was led by the Entente. This was the argument which enabled Lenin to claim at the 10th Party Congress, quote, "The transfer of political power from the hands of the Bolsheviks to a vague conglomeration or alliance of heterogeneous elements who seem to be only a little to the right of the Bolsheviks and perhaps even to the, quote, left, end quote, of the Bolsheviks. So indefinite is the sum of political groupings which tried to seize power in Kronstadt. Undoubtedly, at the same time, white generals, you all know it, played a great part in this. This is fully proved. The Paris newspapers reported a mutiny in Kronstadt 2 weeks before the events in Kronstadt took place," end quote. Apparently that's in Volume 9 of Lenin's selected works. The publication of false news about Russia was nothing exceptional. Such news was published before, during, and after the Kronstadt events. It is undeniable that the bourgeoisie throughout the world was hostile to the Russian Revolution and would exaggerate any bad news emanating from that country. The Second Communist Conference of the Baltic Fleet had just voted a resounding resolution, critical of the political leadership of the fleet. This fact could easily have been exaggerated by the bourgeois press, once again confusing the wishes with reality. To base an accusation on a, quote, proof, end quote, of this kind is inadmissible and immoral. In 1938, Trotsky himself was to drop this accusation, but in the article we have already mentioned, he refers his readers to a study of the Kronstadt rebellion undertaken by an American Trotskyist, John G. Wright. In an article published in the New International in February 1938, Mr. Wright takes up once again the claim that the revolt must have been planned beforehand, in view of the fact the press had announced it on February 15th. He says, quote, "The connection between Kronstadt and the Counterrevolution can be established not only out of the mouths of enemies of Bolshevism, but also on the basis of irrefutable facts." End quote. What irrefutable facts? Again, quotations from the bourgeois press. Le Matin, Faussische Zeitung, The Times, giving false news before and during the insurrection. It is interesting that these arguments were not much used at the time, during the battle itself, but only years later. If at the time the Bolshevik government had proof of these alleged contacts between Kronstadt and the counter-revolutionaries, why did it not try the rebels publicly? Why did it not show the working masses of Russia the, quote, real, end quote, reasons for the uprising? If this wasn't done, it was because no such proof existed. We are also told that if the new economic policy had been introduced in time, the insurrection would have been avoided. But we have just shown the uprising did not take place according to a preconceived plan. As we have just shown, the uprising did not take place according to a preconceived plan. No one knew that it was necessarily going to take place. We have no theory as to the exact timing and development of popular movements, and it is quite possible that under economic and political conditions different from those prevailing in the spring of 1921, the insurrection might never have taken place. On the other hand, the uprising might have occurred in a different form or in a different place. For instance, in Nizhny Novgorod, where an important strike movement took place, coinciding with the great strike wave in Petrograd. The particular conditions relating to the fleet and to Kronstadt's revolutionary past certainly had an effect, but one can't be certain just exactly how significant this effect was. Much the same applies to the statement that, quote, if the NEP had been introduced a few months earlier, there would have been no Kronstadt revolt, end quote. The new economic policy was admittedly proclaimed at the same time as the rebels were being massacred, but it doesn't follow in any way that the NEP corresponded to the demands put forth by the sailors. In the Kronstadt Izvestia of March 14th, we find a characteristic passage on the subject. The rebels proclaim that, quote, Kronstadt is not asking for freedom of trade, but for genuine power to the Soviets, end quote. The Petrograd strikers were also demanding the reopening of the markets and the abolition of roadblocks set up by the militia, but they too were stating that freedom of trade by itself would not solve their problems. Insofar as the new economic policy replaced the forced requisition of foodstuffs by the tax in kind, and insofar as the new economic policy reestablished internal trade, it certainly satisfied some of the demands of the men of Kronstadt and of the striking Petrograd workers. With the new economic policy, rationing and arbitrary seizures ceased. Petty owners were able to sell their goods on the open markets, lessening the effect on the Great Famine. The new economic policy appeared to be first and foremost a safety measure. But the new economic policy unleashed the capitalist elements in the country just at a time when the one-party dictatorship was leaving the proletariat and working-class peasants without means of defense against these capitalist forces. Quote, the class exerting the dictatorship is in fact deprived of the most elementary political rights, end quote, proclaimed the Workers' Truth, an oppositional communist group in 1922. The Workers' Group, another oppositional tendency, characterized the situation as follows. Quote, the working class is totally deprived of rights, the trade unions being a blind instrument in the hands of the functionaries, end quote. This was certainly not what the Kronstadt rebels were asking for. On the contrary, they were proposing measures which would have restored to the working class and working peasantry their true place in the new regime. The Bolsheviks only implemented the least important demands of the Kronstadt program, those coming in 11th place in the resolution of the rebels. They totally ignored the basic demand, the demand for workers' democracy. This demand put forward in the Petropavlovsk Revolution was neither utopian nor dangerous. We here take issue with Victor Serge. In Revolution Proletarienne of September 10, 1937, Serge stated that, quote, while the sailors were engaged in mortal combat, they put forward a demand which, at that particular moment, was extremely dangerous, although quite genuine and sincerely revolutionary. The demand for freely elected Soviets. They wished to unleash a cleansing tornado, but in practice they could only have opened the doors to the peasant counter-revolution, of which the whites and foreign intervention would have taken advantage. Insurgent Kronstadt was not counter-revolutionary, but its victory would inevitably have led to the counter-revolution, end quote. Contrary to Serge's assertion, we believe that the political demands of the sailors were full of a deep political wisdom. They were not derived from any abstract theory, but from a profound awareness of the conditions of Russian life. They were in no way counter-revolutionary. Rosa Luxemburg's views. It is worth recalling that Rosa Luxemburg, a political personality respected throughout the world as a great socialist militant, had written about the lack of democracy in the leadership of the Russian Revolution as early as 1918. Quote, it is an incontestable fact, end quote, she wrote, quote, that the rule of the broad popular masses is inconceivable without unlimited freedom of the press, without absolute freedom of meeting and of association. The gigantic tasks which the Bolsheviks have tackled with courage and resolution require the most intensive political education of the masses and accumulation of experience which is impossible without political freedom. Freedom restricted to those who support the government or to party members only, however numerous they may be, is not real freedom. Freedom is always freedom for the one who thinks differently. This is not because of fanaticism for abstract justice, but because everything that is instructive, healthy, and cleansing in political liberty hinges on this, and because political liberty loses its value when freedom becomes a privilege." End quote. Quote, "We have never worshipped at the altar of formal democracy," end quote, she continued. Quote, "We have always distinguished between the social content and the political form of bourgeois democracy. The historical task facing the proletariat after its accession to power is to replace bourgeois democracy by proletarian democracy, not to abolish all democracy. The dictatorship of the proletariat consists in the way democracy is applied, not in its abolition. It must be the action of the class and not of a small minority managing things in the name of the class. If political life throughout the country is stifled, it must fatally follow that life in the Soviets themselves will be paralyzed. Without general elections, without unlimited freedom of the press and of assembly, without free confrontation of opinions, life will dry up in all public institutions, or it will be only a sham life, where the bureaucracy is the only active element." End quote. We have dwelt on these quotations to show that Rosa Luxemburg, in her statements about the need for democracy, went much further than the Kronstadt rebels. They restricted their comments about democracy to matters of interest to the proletariat and to the working peasantry. Moreover, Rosa Luxemburg formulated her criticisms of the Russian Revolution in 1918 in a period of full civil war, whereas the Petropavlovsk Revolution was voted at a time when the armed struggle had virtually come to an end. Would anyone dare accuse Rosa on the basis of her criticisms of having been in collusion with the international bourgeoisie? Why then are the demands of the Kronstadt sailors denounced as, quote, dangerous, end quote, and as inevitably leading to the counter-revolution? Has not the subsequent evolution of events amply vindicated both the Kronstadt rebels and Rosa Luxemburg? Was Rosa Luxemburg not right when she asserted that the task of the working class was to exercise working class power and not the dictatorship of the party or of a clique? For Rosa Luxemburg, working class power was defined as, quote, the achievement in a contest of the widest discussion, of the most active and unlimited participation of the popular masses in an unrestricted democracy, end quote. A third Soviet revolution. Let me get a swig of water here. When putting forward their democratic demands, the Kronstadt rebels had probably never heard of the writings of Rosa Luxemburg. What they had heard of, however, was the first constitution of the Soviet Republic, voted on July 10, 1918, by the Fifth All-Russian Congress of Soviets. Article 13, 14, 15, and 16 of the Constitution assured all workers of certain democratic rights: freedom of worship, freedom of assembly, freedom of union, freedom of the press. These articles sought to prevent the allocation of special privileges to any specific group or party. Articles 22 and 23. The same Constitution proclaimed that no worker could be deprived of the right to vote or of the right to stand as a candidate, provided he satisfied the conditions stipulated in Articles 64 and 65, that is to say, provided he did not exploit the labor of others or live off income other than that which he had earned. The central demand of the Kronstadt insurrection, all power to the Soviets and not to the party, was in fact based on an article of the Constitution. This proclaimed that all central and local power would henceforth be precisely in the hands of the Soviets. From the very beginning, this Constitution was violated by the Bolsheviks, or rather, its provisions were never put into effect. It is worth recalling that Rosa Luxemburg's criticisms were formulated a few months after the vote of this new constitution charter, when in 1921 the sailors were to insist on a genuine application of the rights they had acquired in 1918. They were called, quote, counter-revolutionaries, end quote, and denounced as, quote, agents of the international bourgeoisie, end quote. 16 years later, Victor Serge was to say that the demands of the rebels would necessarily have led to the counter-revolution. This shows how deep-going were Bolshevik attitudes concerning the dangers of democracy. The basic laws of the Soviet Republic constitute a juridical summary of the ideology of the October Revolution. By the end of the Civil War, these ideas had been pushed so far back that a third revolution would have been necessary to reinstate them and have them applied in everyday life. This is what the Kronstadt rebels meant when they spoke of the Third Revolution. In the Kronstadt Izvestia of March 8th, they wrote, quote, "At Kronstadt, the foundation stone had been laid of the Third Revolution. This will break the final chains which will bind the working masses and will open up new paths of socialist creation," end quote. We do not know if it would have been possible to save the conquest of October by democratic methods. We do not know if the economic situation of the country and its markedly peasant character were really suitable for the first attempt at building socialism. These problems should be discussed, but the task of those seeking truth is to proclaim the facts without embellishments. It is not good enough to take a superciliously scientific air to explain away historical phenomena. When Trotsky sought to explain the development of the bureaucracy which had strangled all real life in the institution of the Soviet state, he found no difficulty in outlining his conception. In The Revolution Betrayed, he states that one of the important causes was the fact that the demobilized Red Army officers had come to occupy leading positions in local Soviets and had introduced military methods into them at a time when the proletariat was exhausted following the prolonged revolutionary upheaval. This apparently led to the birth of the bureaucracy. Trotsky omits to recall how he himself sought to introduce precisely these methods into the trade unions. Was it to save the proletariat further fatigue? And if the proletariat was that exhausted, how come it was still capable of waging virtually total general strikes in the largest and most heavily industrialized cities? And if the party was still really the driving force of the social revolution, how come it did not help the proletariat in the struggle against the nascent but already powerful bureaucracy, instead of shooting the workers down at a time when their energy had been sapped by 3 years of imperialist war, followed by 3 years of civil war? Why did the Communist Party identify itself with the authoritarian state? The answer is that the party was no longer revolutionary. It was no longer proletarian, and this is precisely what the men of Kronstadt were blaming the party for. Their merit is to have said all this in 1921 when it might still have been possible to change the situation, and not to have waited 15 years by which time the defeat had become irrevocable. Bureaucracy is almost a hereditary hallmark in Russia. It is as old as the Russian state itself. The Bolsheviks in power not only inherited the czarist bureaucracy itself, but its very spirit, its very atmosphere. They should have realized that as the state enlarged its functions to encompass economic affairs, as it became the owner of all natural wealth and of industry, an immediate danger would arise of the rebirth and rapid development of the bureaucratic frame of mind. A doctor treating a patient with a bad heredity takes this into account and advises certain precautions. What precautions did the Bolsheviks take to combat the bureaucratic tendencies which are obvious in the very first years of the revolution? What methods could they have used other than to allow a powerful democratic drought to blow through the whole atmosphere and to encourage a rigorous and effective control to be exerted by the working masses? True enough, some form of control was envisaged. The trouble was that the commissariat of the workers' and peasants' inspection was to entrust this control to the very same type of bureaucrat whose power it was seeking to thwart. One need not seek far to find the causes of the bureaucratization. Its roots lay deeply in the Bolshevik concept of the state commanded and controlled by a single party, itself organized along absolutist and bureaucratic lines. These causes were, of course, aggravated by Russia's own bureaucratic traditions. It is wrong to blame the peasantry for the defeat of the revolution and for its degeneration into a bureaucratic regime. It would be too easy to explain all Russia's difficulties by the agrarian character of her economy. Some people seem to say at one and the same time that the Kronstadt revolt against the bureaucracy was a peasant revolt, and that the bureaucracy itself was of peasant origin. With such a concept of the role of the peasantry, one may ask how the Bolsheviks dared advocate the idea of socialist revolution. How did they dare struggle for socialist revolution in an agrarian country? Some claim that the Bolsheviks allowed themselves such actions as the suppression of Kronstadt in the hope of a forthcoming world revolution, of which they considered themselves the vanguard. But would not a revolution in another country have been influenced by the spirit of the Russian Revolution? When one considers the enormous moral authority of the Russian Revolution throughout the world, one may ask oneself whether the deviations of this revolution would not eventually have left an imprint on other countries. Many historical facts allow such a judgment. One may recognize the impossibility of genuine socialist construction in a single country, yet have doubts as to whether the bureaucratic deformations of the Bolshevik regime would have been straightened out by the winds coming from revolutions in other countries. The fascist experience in countries like Germany shows that an advanced stage of capitalist development is an insufficient guarantee against the growth of absolutist and autocratic tendencies. Although this is not the place to explain the phenomenon, we must note the powerful wave of authoritarianism coming from economically advanced countries and threatening to engulf old ideas and traditions. It is incontestable that Bolshevism is morally related to this absolutist frame of mind. It had in fact set a precedent for subsequent tendencies. No one can be sure that had another revolution occurred elsewhere following the one in Russia, Bolshevism would have democratized itself. It might again have revealed its absolutist features. Were there not real dangers in the democratic way? Was there no reason to fear reformist influences in the Soviets if democracy had been given full free rein? We accept that this was a real danger, but it was no more of a danger than what inevitably followed the uncontrolled dictatorship of a single party, whose general secretary was already Stalin. Footnote. Ida Mett is wrong in implying that Stalin was general secretary of the party at the time of the event she is describing. The post of general secretary and Stalin's appointment to it, incidentally endorsed by both Lenin and Trotsky, only took place in 1922. End footnote. We are told that the country was at the end of its tether, that it had lost its ability to resist. True, the country was weary of war, but on the other hand, it was full of constructive forces ardently seeking to learn and to educate themselves. The end of the Civil War saw a surge of workers and peasants towards schools, workers' universities, and institutions of technical education. Wasn't this yearning the best testimony to the vitality and resistance of these classes? In a country with a very high level of illiteracy, such an education could greatly have helped the working masses in the genuine exercise of real power. But by its very essence, a dictatorship destroys the creative capacities of a people. Despite the undoubted attempts of the government to educate workers, education soon became the privilege of party members loyal to the leading faction. From 1921 on, workers' faculties and higher educational establishments were purged of their more independent-minded elements. This process gained tempo with the development of oppositional tendencies within the party. The attempt at a genuine mass education was increasingly compromised. Lenin's wish that every cook should be able to govern the state became less and less likely to be implemented. The revolutionary conquest could only be deepened through a genuine participation of the masses. Any attempt to substitute a, quote, elite, end quote, for those masses could only be profoundly reactionary. In 1921, the Russian Revolution stood at the crossroads. The democratic or dictatorial way, that was the question. By lumping together bourgeois and proletarian democracy, the Bolsheviks were in fact condemning both. They sought to build socialism from above through skillful maneuvers of the revolutionary general staff. While waiting for a world revolution that was not around the corner, they built a state-capitalist society where the working class no longer had the right to make the decisions most intimately concerning it. Lenin was not alone in perceiving that the Kronstadt rebellion was a challenge to this plan. Both he and the Bolsheviks were fully aware that what was at stake was the monopoly of their party. Kronstadt might have opened the way to a genuine proletarian democracy, incompatible with the party's monopoly of power. That is why Lenin preferred to destroy Kronstadt. He chose an ignoble but sure way, the calumny that Kronstadt was allied to the bourgeoisie and to the agrarian counterrevolution. When Kaufmann, commissar of the Baltic Fleet, had stated at the Kronstadt meeting of March 2nd that the Bolsheviks would not surrender power without a fight, he was saying the truth. Lenin must have laughed at this commissar who obviously didn't understand the ABC of Bolshevik morality or tactics. Politically and morally, one had to destroy the opponent, not argue with him using real arguments. And destroy its revolutionary opponents is exactly what the Bolshevik government did. The Kronstadt rebels were a gray, amorphous mass, but such masses occasionally show an incredible level of political awareness. If there had been among them a number of men of, quote, higher, end quote, political understanding, the insurrection might well never have taken place, for those men would have understood, firstly, that the demands of the rebels were in flagrant conflict with the policies of the Kremlin, and secondly, that at that particular moment in time, the government felt itself firmly enough in the saddle to shoot down without pity or mercy any tendency daring seriously to oppose its views or plans. The men of Kronstadt were sincere but naive. Believing in the justness of their case, they did not foresee the tactics of their opponents. They waited for help from the rest of the country, whose demands they knew they were voicing. They lost sight of the fact that the rest of the country was already in the iron grip of a dictatorship which no longer allowed the people the free expression of its wishes and the free choice of its institutions. The great ideological and political discussions between, quote, realists, end quote, and, quote, dreamers, end quote, between, quote, scientific socialists, end quote, and the, quote, revolutionary Volnitsa, end quote, open Congress, was fought out, weapons in hand. It ended in 1921 with the political and military defeat of the, quote, dreamers, end quote. But Stalin was to prove to the whole world that this defeat was also the defeat of socialism over a sixth of the Earth's surface.